Chapter 17 of The Return of Alfred by Herbert George Jenkins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 17. Mr. Gadgett Pays a Call. Just as P.C. Postle emerged from his fowlhouse to receive the complaint of the stranger with the auburn moustache, Janet entered the vicarage drawing-room. "A gentleman has called to see you, sir," she announced. "To see me?" queried Smith, looking up from the writing-table, where he was engaged in glancing through the pages of an illustrated paper. "Yes, sir. He said Mr. Willis sent him over from the Grange. He wouldn't give his name, sir." "Always a suspicious sign, that," murmured Smith. "By the way, whom did he happen to ask for?" "For you, Mr. Warren." "That is to say, for Mr. Alfred Warren?" "Yes, sir." "Janet, haven't I told you 1,000 times that I am not Mr. Alfred Warren, but Mr. Smith?" "Yes, Mr. Warren." "Show him in," he said wearily. When the door once more opened, Smith rose to find himself facing a little ferret-faced man, sandy where he was not bald, and with a chin that manifested a marked inclination to retreat down his collar. As he entered, he gave a swift glance round the room, his shifty little eyes blinking craftily. At the sight of Smith, an evil expression passed over his unprepossessing features. "Mr. Alfred Warren?" he interrogated. "Sometimes I almost wish I were," said Smith, who was speculating as to what particular period of Alfred Warren's activities his caller represented. "As it is, I'm always disappointing people. Won't you sit down, Mr. Gadgett, of the firm of Gadgett, Grandson and Gadgett, solicitors of New Court, London, W.C." "And may I take it that you are the grandson?" enquired Smith gravely. "I'm the senior partner, Mr. Grimthorpe Gadgett," he replied, with a touch of self-importance. "Thank you," said Smith, with the air of one who has settled an important point. "Am I addressing Mr. Alfred Warren?" "You are not," smiled Smith. For a moment Mr. Gadgett looked nonplussed. His face assumed an even more ferrety expression. He gazed at Smith as if trying to read his thoughts. "Then may I enquire who it is I have the pleasure of addressing?" "Certainly. My name is James Smith." Mr. Gadgett glanced up at him sharply. It was obvious that the answer was unexpected. "We are a large family, we Smiths," said Smith, as he sank back into a chair opposite that taken by Mr. Gadgett. "In the London Telephone Directory alone there are 14 columns of us, including 24 gentlemen who frankly confess to the name of James. I looked it up myself. It's a terrible inheritance, Mr. Gadgett, a name such as mine." Whilst Smith was speaking, Mr. Gadgett had opened a small leather attaché case he carried. Taking out a photograph, he gazed at it intently, then across at Smith, and finally back again at the photograph. "I enquired at the Grange for Mr. Alfred Warren," he said at length, "and I was told to come here." "That would be Willis," said Smith easily. "You never can be sure what Willis will be up to. If you had enquired for the Grand Lama himself, you would in all probability have been told he was here." "Am I to take it that you maintain you are not Mr. Alfred Warren?" Mr. Gadgett's eyes returned to the photograph. "There would be no risk whatever in such an assumption." "Then why, may I ask, was I sent here when I enquired for Mr. Warren?" he demanded, his eyes snapping venomously. "That involves psychoanalysis and family history," was the reply. "The psychoanalysis being necessary to interpret Willis, and the family history to explain the disappearance of Mr. Warren some 7 years ago, and the discovery of James Smith a few days since." "In the village I was given to understand that Mr. Warren had returned after a long absence, and was living here. Is that correct?" "Which statement do you wish me to verify?" enquired Smith. "That you are assured of the circumstance, or that the circumstance of which you are assured is an actual fact?" "We're wasting time, sir," said Mr. Gadgett, with a touch of asperity in his voice. "The question is, are you or are you not Mr. Alfred Warren?" "I've just told you that my name is James Smith," was the reply. "If I am James Smith, Mr. Gadgett, you, as a lawyer, must realise that I cannot be Alfred Warren. May I in turn enquire why it is you are subjecting me to this cross-examination?" "I must first establish your identity before I can proceed," said Mr. Gadgett. "Then I fear you are in for a troublesome business," was the smiling reply. "For the past week I have been endeavouring to do that self same thing, but with the most miserable results. I suspect that nothing short of an Act of Parliament or direct action can establish my identity, because " "Because?" prompted Mr. Gadgett. "Because I don't seem to have an identity. At least, not one about which there appears to be any unanimity of opinion. I'm a sort of stormy petrel. Wherever I go I seem to excite faction. In this peaceful little village, for instance, I've aroused the devil's own dissensions. Nothing like it has been known since the Wars of the Roses." For nearly a minute Mr. Gadgett sat pondering the photograph in his hand, his eyes shifting restlessly, always avoiding Smith's steady gaze. "Sir," he said at length, "I venture to suggest that you are deliberately adopting an attitude of verbal ambiguity, and it is my duty to warn you that such a line of defence will not in any way benefit you." "And I, on my part," said Smith, with a smile that gave no indication of what was to follow, "warn you, Mr. Gadgett, that unless you are reasonably civil, I shall throw you out of that window into Miss Lipscombe's favourite bed of begonias. They're mostly prize plants, by the way." Mr. Gadgett started back in his chair, his little eyes blinking apprehensively. He glanced furtively about him as if in search of a line of retreat. "That is a threat of violence, sir," he blustered. "An attempt to intimidate." "As a matter of fact, it is neither the one nor the other. It is just a prophecy. We Smiths are like that, at least those of us who are not hyphenated. It's no doubt due to our sensitiveness," he continued, that Mr. Gadgett remained silent. "The least suggestion of discourtesy and " He paused significantly. "I'm sorry if " began Mr. Gadgett. "Don't be sorry," said Smith. "Just be explicit." He was enjoying Mr. Gadgett's embarrassment, so obviously tinctured with fear. He sat blinking his eyes uncertainly, looking more ferret-like than ever. It was clear he found some difficulty in deciding his mode of procedure. Smith sat gazing at him like a good-humoured mastiff at a small dog that has barked a challenge. "To prevent any misunderstanding, Mr. Gadgett," continued Smith, "I think it only right to say that I used to be regarded as a light heavyweight of some promise." "That, I suggest, is a covert threat of violence," said Mr. Gadgett. "On the contrary, it is merely a little piece of biographical information that may tend to preserve the peace the King is supposed to value so much. You have rather an unfortunate manner, Mr. Gadgett," he added, still smiling. "Doubtless it is unintentional." "I repeat," said Mr. Gadgett at length, "that if I have said anything calculated to cause you irritation or annoyance " He paused. "You cannot repeat what you have not already stated," said Smith evenly. "As a matter of fact, your presence causes me both." "I'm sorry " began Mr. Gadgett. "You've just said that." Smith glanced significantly at the watch on his wrist. "Don't you think you might take the plunge and tell me why you have called?" "I came," said Mr. Gadgett, "to interview the gentleman who is known here as Mr. Alfred Warren." "I gathered as much from your previous remarks," was the dry retort. Smith was determined to render him no assistance. "As a lawyer you will realise that the actual expression of other people's opinions does not involve me in any liability." "If you are not he who is known in this neighbourhood as Mr. Alfred Warren, then where can I find the gentleman in question?" Smith shrugged his shoulders with the air of one who acknowledges that the problem is beyond him. "Mr. Smith, I have decided, for the purpose of my visit, to assume that you are the gentleman who has been identified in this neighbourhood as Mr. Alfred Warren." Mr. Gadgett paused and glanced swiftly at Smith, who, however, evinced no emotion. "It is therefore," he continued, with more assurance in his voice, "it is therefore my duty to inform you that some years ago, before going abroad, the real Mr. Alfred Warren placed his affairs in the hands of my firm, with instructions to take such steps as we may deem necessary to protect his interests and reputation. Do I make myself clear?" "Abundantly." "Have you anything to say?" Mr. Gadgett's former assurance of manner was returning to him. "I was wondering," said Smith quietly, "if that little bit about protecting his reputation was your idea or his?" "You must understand, Mr. Smith, that, presuming I am right in my assumption that you are he who is generally accepted as Mr. Alfred Warren, you are running a very considerable risk." "We all run risks, Mr. Gadgett," said Smith evenly. "The world is full of them. That is why we buy newspapers, to insure against the mere risk of living. Quite recently I played cricket in flannel reach-me-downs." "That is not relevant to the matter under discussion." "On the contrary, it is peculiarly relevant. You think of my risks, I think of yours. I should hate to see you take a header into that begonia bed." Smith significantly felt the biceps of his left arm. Mr. Gadgett rose and performed a strategic movement that placed the chair on which he had been sitting between him and Smith. "We do not wish to be unduly precipitate in any action we take," he said over the back of the chair. "I commend your wisdom," was the dry rejoinder. "It is that fact which accounts for my presence here today," continued Mr. Gadgett. Smith nodded. "I have it in my power to prove that you are not Mr. Warren," announced Mr. Gadgett, with the air of a man who is playing a trump card. "Mr. Gadgett," said Smith impressively, "you are the man I have been looking for. If you can do as you say, then the moving of mountains is a mere bagatelle." "Have you, Mr. Smith, anything to say before I take my departure?" "Nothing," said Smith, glancing once more at his wrist watch, "except to thank you for calling," he added. "In the light of anything that may subsequently transpire," continued Mr. Gadgett, as he backed towards the door, "you will recall that I approached you with a view to hearing any explanation you might have to make, and see if a satisfactory settlement could be arrived at." "I most certainly shall." "I have sent 2 letters to Mr. Alfred Warren at the Grange. Did you receive them?" "Mr. Warren has not authorized me to deal with his correspondence." "I take it," began Mr. Gadgett. "Don't," said Smith. "It's safer." "I'm afraid we're not progressing," said Mr. Gadgett, who had apparently forgotten his intention of terminating the interview. "I quite agree with you." "You will pardon me, Mr. Smith, if I say that you are now faced with a matter requiring the most careful and well considered judgment. I will add that I apologize for any offence I may unwittingly have caused, and—" He paused. "Enough, Mr. Gadgett," said Smith. "I think you may now safely resume your chair." Acting on the hint, Mr. Gadgett slid round the chair with obvious relief. "It has come to our knowledge, Mr. Smith—" "Smith without the 'er' sounds better," said Smith evenly. "That you recently threatened a gentleman with violence," continued Mr. Gadgett. "You mean Mr. Bluggs," suggested Smith. The process of sweetening the memory of the absent Alfred promised to be more interesting than had at first appeared likely. "I refer to Mr. Jonathan Bluggs, and I feel I ought to inform you that such threats are calculated to prejudice your case. It was—" "A holly bush," came the smiling interruption. "You see, we were some way from the begonia bed. Besides, he was peculiarly offensive." "You realise, of course, that it is within Mr. Bluggs's power to have you bound over," said Mr. Gadgett. He gave Smith the impression of one talking to gain time, apparently with a view to deciding his line of action. As Smith made no comment, he turned once more to the likeness he still held in his hand. "The likeness is certainly very remarkable," he said. "Physically it is almost uncanny," remarked Smith dryly. Mr. Gadgett winced a little. He was still obviously nervous, and Smith realised that he desired to say something which he found it difficult to frame in words. "Were you—" he began, then paused. "Was I—" interrogated Smith with polite indifference. "You have been at Little Bilstead for several days?" "This is the 8th, to be exact," was the rejoinder. "Have you during that time met with any—" He paused again. "I mean, has your stay been a pleasant one?" "Eminently," said Smith with a smile. At first I was regarded a little coldly, except at the Grange, where Willis spent much of his time in following me about with a decanter." "And outside the Grange?" inquired Mr. Gadgett hastily. "Fair to medium. I made friends with the vicar, have been denounced by a peppery old colonel, managed to invest a dislike of a pretty girl, knocked up one short of the century at cricket, and well, that's about all so far." "Will you permit me to put a few questions to you, Smith?" "With pleasure," said Smith, amused at the change in Mr. Gadgett's tone. "By the way, you've already put 2 or 3." "Have you any reason to believe—" began Mr. Gadgett. He paused, then, as if deciding upon another course of action, he said, "I'll be quite frank with you, Mr. Smith." This time he got the name without the preliminary "er." Frankness is always refreshing. There was a short pause. From the ferrety snapping of Mr. Gadgett's eyes, Smith realised that he was about to spring his mine. He had clearly been working up to something dramatic. "Are you aware, Mr. Smith," he began, emphasising the name, "that there is a warrant out for the arrest of Mr. Warren?" "The deuce there is!" cried Smith, startled in spite of himself, and sitting up straight in his chair. This was an aspect of the sweetening process he had not bargained for. Mr. Gadgett displayed the yellowness of 2 particularly evil-looking canines. His mine was a success. "It was issued 6 years ago," he said, "and, as I happen to know, it has never been withdrawn." "And why do you come to tell me this?" enquired Smith, a stern look coming into his eyes. "We may possibly be of assistance to you," was the fluid rejoinder. "In our professional capacity," he added. "And why was the warrant issued?" "In connection with the death of a girl named Thirkettle. Before she died she made a statement," he added, with a leer. "I think you have given me sufficient data to be going on with," said Smith, rising. There was a whiteness at the corners of his set mouth that caused Mr. Gadgett some anxiety. "I think that is all I need trouble you with at present," he said as he rose, having first stowed away the photograph in his case. "We do not propose to take action for a week or 10 days," he added. "I shall not forget." "You have our address," said Mr. Gadgett significantly. "I have," said Smith. "I am glad you came." "Thank you, Mr. Smith," and Mr. Gadgett made a repulsive movement with his dust-coloured lips, which his intimates would have recognised as a smile. "So am I." "Because," said Smith quietly, "you are the first blackmailer I have ever met." Mr. Gadgett's jaw fell. For a moment he gazed at Smith, fear in his eyes. "That is—" He stopped suddenly and began to back nervously towards the door. There was something in Smith's look that suggested Miss Lipscombe's bed of begonias. "You know Alfred Warren to be dead?" It was a shot at a venture, but in the apprehensive look in Mr. Gadgett's turbid eyes, Smith thought he saw a confirmation of his words. The next moment Mr. Gadgett had slid round the door and disappeared. "So that was why A.W. bolted," murmured Smith, as he stepped out from the French windows on to the lawn. There was something about the moral atmosphere of Mr. Gadgett that made fresh air essential. He turned and walked slowly down the drive, his face grave. This process of sweetening the memory of the absent Alfred seemed likely to involve him in serious complications. It was not pleasant to contemplate arrest, but on such a charge it was intolerable. He could prove his innocence of the crime and of being Alfred. Still, there was all the unpleasantness and the scandal. It was obvious that the unspeakable Gadgett was out for blackmail, disguised as some form of professional service. He had heard of such solicitors, but had never believed they really existed. Such forms of animal life ought to be trodden on, he decided. Was Alfred Warren alive or dead? That was the question. The startled look in Gadgett's eyes, coupled with the hurried nature of his departure, certainly looked suspicious, but suspicion was not proof. Then how had he got to know about Bluggs? Was he in league with that gold-toothed abomination? Taken all round, he was in the very... He stopped suddenly at the sound of a cry, something between a yelp and a scream, which appeared to come from somewhere in the neighbourhood of the vicarage gates. Hurrying along the drive, he passed out into the road just as another yelp broke the drowsy stillness of the summer afternoon. This time it developed into a howl. Smith gazed along the road in the direction of the Grange. As far as the eye could reach, there was no spot or blemish upon its ribboned whiteness. Obviously the drama was being enacted in the opposite direction, where the road took a sharp turn towards the village. Running the few steps necessary to gain a view round the bend, Smith was met by a sight and sound that brought him once more to a standstill. There in the middle of the road lay Mr. Gadgett, at least he judged it to be Mr. Gadgett. The hat and attaché case that lay a few yards off were certainly his. Mr. Gadgett himself seemed to be somewhere beneath a body infinitely larger than his own, encased in a startling scheme of brown and white checks. Mr. Gadgett appeared to be engaged in screaming for mercy, invoking the aid alike of God and man, whilst his thin legs worked like flails. It was obvious that Mr. Gadgett was getting it in the neck. Hastening forward, Smith seized a handful of the checked material and hauled with all his might. There was a gasping sound from the upper part of the mound, and, a moment later, a foxy little figure wriggled from beneath the mountain of checks. It was indeed Mr. Gadgett, and a very agile Mr. Gadgett. Before Smith quite realised what was happening, he had gathered up his hat and case and was legging it down the road towards the village as if the Inquisition itself were after him. Turning to the brown and white checked assailant, whose collar he had been grasping, Smith, by a movement of his wrist, swung him round. "Peters!" He released his hold and stood gazing at the man in sheer bewilderment. "What the devil does this mean?" he demanded, his eyes still upon the perspiring face from which an auburn moustache stood out with astonishing suddenness. "I'm taking a holiday, sir," was the reply of the man whom Eric had pinked, and Peters proceeded to draw a large bandana handkerchief from his pocket and mop his streaming forehead. He was a big man and unaccustomed to any form of violent exercise. "And is this your idea of a holiday?" demanded Smith. "Battering the life out of a man half your own size?" "That was Private Gadgett, sir," he said, as calm as if in his own pantry. "That, Peters," said Smith severely, "is Mr. Grimthorpe Gadgett, of Gadgett, Grandson and Gadgett, Solicitors of New Court, London, W.C., as he has just informed me. What the devil are you doing?" In what appeared to be one movement, Peters had returned the handkerchief to his pocket, produced a notebook, and was apparently engaged in making a note of something. "I'm taking down the address, sir," he said, without raising his eyes from the page. "Why?" "It will be useful, sir." "The devil it will!" cried Smith. "How?" "Private Gadgett deserted from our regiment one night when out on patrol, sir, in the final advance," continued Peters. "And the Huns, the Germans, sir," he corrected himself, "surprised a working party and killed 6 men." "The swine!" The words broke from between Smith's clenched teeth, and he was not thinking of the Huns. "My company commander ordered me, if ever I caught him, to smash his face in. I was doing it when you interrupted me, sir," he added. "Peters," said Smith gravely, "I owe you an apology." "Thank you, sir." "By the look of what he took away with him, however, you seem to have achieved your mission," he added drily. Peters looked doubtful. It was evident that in his code of ethics a man with a smashed face ought not to be able to run away. "But what the devil do you mean by turning up here?" Smith demanded, suddenly recalling the strangeness of the encounter. "I was in pursuit of a boy, sir." Smith stared at him. "You don't happen to have turned Bolshevist, I suppose?" he enquired. "He assaulted me with a catapult," said Peters, with expressionless face. "I don't wonder at it, in that get-up," smiled Smith, venturing a guess at the identity of the "boy." "It's like a musical comedy." "The boy escaped, sir," continued Peters. "It was then that I saw Private Gadgett and " "Proceeded to smash his face," suggested Smith, as Peters paused. "But that does not account for your turning up here in this fashion, and in those extraordinary clothes. I developed engine trouble, sir, my motor cycle, sir," he added. "You invariably do." "I think, sir, I mentioned that I was going to Norfolk because " "Your old bus wouldn't climb hills," broke in Smith with a smile. "I've certainly had a considerable amount of trouble with my motor cycle," agreed Peters. "I think it must be the petrol." The avoirdupois, you mean?" "Sir?" interrogated Peters. "When you put about 15 stone on a broken-winded motor bike like yours, Peters, and then expect it to take a hill at a canter, you're asking for trouble." "Yes, sir," said Peters dutifully. "Incidentally, Peters, I am in the very deuce of a hole," Smith continued. "I've not only been written off as a bad debt by my uncle, but I've also been proclaimed the returned prodigal of Little Bilstead, and it's the very devil." "Yes, sir," said Peters, his face immobile as the Houses of Parliament. "But I can't tell you now, there isn't time." "I feel I ought to inform you, sir, that Sir John has written to me." "Written to you?" "Yes, sir." "Then how the devil did he know—" "Soon after I started I developed engine—" "Oh, damn your engine trouble, Peters. Let us take it for granted." "Certainly, sir," said Peters in his best professional manner. "I returned to London for certain repairs, and I took the opportunity of calling at the flat, sir, where I found a number of letters." "And some bills?" suggested Smith. "A large proportion of the correspondence bore evidence of having come from tradesmen," admitted Peters. "There was also a letter from Sir John asking for your address, sir." "I hope you wrote and told him I'd gone to the devil." "No, sir. I informed him that you had entered upon a new life of usefulness." "A new life of what?" he demanded. "I mentioned, sir, that you hoped by industry and application and attention to detail that you would merit—" "You've been reading some infernal tradesman's circular, Peters. What the deuce do you mean by writing such utter balderdash to Sir John?" "I thought it would probably appeal to him, sir," said Peters, as devoid of expression as a barrel piano. "If I may say so, Sir John is very much attached to you, sir." "Peters, you're indulging in what the Americans call sop stuff. You've been reading The Lamplighter, or A Peep Behind the Scenes. In the idiom of the modern flapper, you're getting soppy." "I'm sorry, sir." "You need not be, Peters. It's an emotional state largely due to films. Did my uncle say what he wanted me for?" "I think, sir, he found his heart softening." "Like your brains, Peters," smiled Smith. "What are your plans now?" "For the moment, sir, I have no plans. I have to return to Norwich to get a new magneto. I think that is the cause of the trouble I have with the engine." "You can do better," said Smith with sudden inspiration. "You can go to town and get me some clothes." "Yes, sir." "You know what you packed. I've wrecked the raincoat in climbing a gate, and the suit I wore has ceased to be a suit and is merely a study in exposure. When you get back, come up to the vicarage and ask for the keys of the church, then we can arrange to smuggle the things in." "Yes, sir," said Peters, as if he were being asked for a whisky and soda. "Now you'd better slip off," said Smith. "It won't do for us to be seen together." "No, sir," said Peters vaguely. "Great Gulliver!" Smith cried suddenly. "Why, Peters, you're the deus ex machina of this adventure." "Am I, sir?" "You most certainly are," he assured him. "You'll have to follow up this Gadgett fellow." He paused, to see the effect of the announcement. "That was my intention, sir," said Peters. "The deuce it was." "Yes, sir." "And you will exert such influence as you possess with ex-Private Gadgett," continued Smith, "to extract from him full particulars, documentary or otherwise, as to the death or present whereabouts of one Alfred Warren of the Grange, Little Bilstead. That's where we now are." "Very good, sir," and Peters once more drew forth his notebook. "If he's difficult, suggest the War Office, and, failing that, hint at publishing the story of his desertion." "Very good, sir," repeated Peters, as he replaced the pencil in the slot at the back of his notebook and returned it to his pocket, a baleful look in his prominent eyes. "And, Peters?" "Yes, sir." "After you have obtained the information I require, you can then get to work upon his face." "Thank you, sir. Will that be all, sir?" "By the way, how long will it take you to get to Jermyn Street and back?" he enquired casually. "I think, sir, I ought to do it in a week," said Peters gravely, "if the engine trouble doesn't get worse, sir." Chapter 18 of The Return of Alfred by Herbert George Jenkins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 18 Eric Plays a Part 1. "I say, you haven't been—" Eric paused, and screwing up his eyebrows regarded Smith with the air of one who finds it difficult to express what is in his mind. "I haven't been—" queried Smith. "You know, I told you that you'd find Marjie a regular old water jump," suggested Smith, as the boy paused once more. "You most certainly did, Eric. You know, she's frightfully dece," he added hastily, as if in his previous words he had been guilty of disloyalty. "But—" Again he paused. "But what?" enquired Smith. "You see," Eric continued, after frowning at Smith for several seconds. The sun was in his eyes, and he was puzzled how to proceed. "You see, I'm afraid she doesn't altogether like you yet," he added. "I, too, had begun to suspect it," said Smith dryly. "Well, you see," cried Eric, his brow clearing, "we've got to make her." "We?" "Yes, you and me. You see," he continued confidentially, "women are like that. They never like the fellows that they really like." "I see." "You know, Marjie used to be quite all right until she grew up." Eric was finding verbal expression somewhat difficult. "Girls are like that. You should have seen her climb trees," he cried with enthusiasm. "She would go up like a monkey. But now—" His look expressed disgust. "Am I to gather that, in your opinion, my learning to climb trees with agility would be a short cut to your sister's favour?" enquired Smith. "It wouldn't make a bit of diff," he said, shaking his head lugubriously. "You see, you did paint the place a bit purp, didn't you?" Eric gazed at Smith with screwed up eyes. Loyalty demanded that there should be some excuse for Marjorie's dislike. "You mean Warren?" Smith suggested. "Oh, I forgot the wang," grinned the boy. "Anyhow, you can't blame Marjie, can you?" "Far be it from me to blame anyone." "You know, I've been thinking things over, and I've come to I think you're wrong." "Wrong?" "About the wang, you know," he added hastily. "I got the idea in church on Sunday." Smith nodded encouragingly. "I don't often take notice of sermons," there was apology in his tone, "but as it was about the sinner that repenteth, you know, and all that sort of thing, it reminded me of you." "That was very nice of you," said Smith gravely, as he proceeded to fill his pipe. "You see—" Eric paused. "I'm afraid I don't," said Smith, without raising his eyes from his pipe bowl. "I say, I hope I don't seem impert." There was anxiety in his voice. "On the contrary, I'm sure you're going to be extremely helpful," said Smith, looking up with a smile. "Carry on." "If you were to own up and say you really are A.W.," he burst out, "they'd soon forgive you, even if you are Mr. Smith," he added apologetically. "You see, there'll be another match next year, and those blighters will be out for revenge, and I want you to bowl to me for practice," he added ingeniously. "I see," said Smith, as he struck a match and became absorbed in lighting his pipe. "You never know just what Marjie will do," Eric continued, with the air of one who has experienced something of the vagaries of a woman's temperament. "She might be all over you if she thought you were sorry." He paused and gazed at Smith tentatively. "Sorry for what?" he queried. "Oh, for everything. Of course, I don't remember much, but you made things pretty hot. I mean, A.W. did," he added hastily, looking up uncertainly at Smith, as if in doubt as to how his remarks would be received. "And you think," said Smith, "that if I were to own up to being an unspeakable blackguard, I might be forgiven?" "Oh, I say, I didn't mean that, you know," protested Eric hurriedly. "You know girls are so jolly funny. Marjie'll take home any beastly mongrel if it looks miserable. She gets it from the dad. He's a topper." "In other words, you suggest that I should stoop, or rather grovel, to conquer?" "I " began Eric, then he stopped. Put like that, somehow, the idea didn't seem quite right. "I'll tell you something," he said suddenly, with a hasty glance over his shoulder. "There used to be a girl in a tuck shop at Wilchester that I was awfully gone on. She wouldn't look at me though, just tossed her head and sniffed. I heard afterwards she was engaged to a plumber, an awful cad. One day I cut my finger, then she was all over me. After that I had to hurt myself once a week, but she always wanted to see the damage." With difficulty Smith restrained a smile at the man of the worldly air with which Eric made his confession. "But just where does what you call the wang come in?" he enquired. "You just own up," said Eric, after a slight hesitation. "I always do, when they find out," he added, as an afterthought. "I'll think it over," said Smith gravely. "I suppose cutting my finger wouldn't do?" Eric shook his head, then, realising that Smith was "pulling his tib," as he was wont to express it, he grinned. "You know, Marjie's frightfully funny," he continued. "Only last month she picked up a dog that had got run over. Covered in mud and blood it was. She's spoilt her things. And we're not rich, you know," he added, to give point to the story. "Eric," said Smith with the utmost solemnity, "I find you most encouraging." For a moment the boy gazed at him doubtfully; but seeing not even the flicker of a smile upon Smith's grave face, he took heart. "You just try it," he advised. "I say, you will bowl to me?" he added anxiously. "I must get used to fast bowling by next year. I mean the goods, not half volleys, and full tosses to leg," he added. "A lot will of course depend on the wang," said Smith meditatively. "You just drop it, and see if I'm not right," cried Eric, with a sigh of relief at the success of his diplomacy. "Now I must toddle," and he made a movement to depart. "By the way," said Smith, "you do not say how I had best proceed. You see, I scarcely ever see Marjorie." "You be at the edge of Buckdale Wood this afternoon just after 4, and I'll tell you then. Near the pond. You know it, don't you?" he enquired anxiously. "Intimately," said Smith. "But why not tell me now?" "Can't. Frightfully busy. 'Slong," and with that he was gone. "The mercenary young scamp," muttered Smith as he sucked at his pipe, "to sell a sister for bowling practice." 2. Smith was a few minutes late for his appointment with Eric, due to what seemed an obvious short cut; but a dyke intervened and he had been forced to go back. As he came within sight of the wood, he was surprised to see Marjorie sitting on the trunk of a fallen tree, with Nero grazing contentedly beside her. At the sound of Smith's approach, Nero raised an alert head. Recognising his sugar man, he gave a little snort of pleasure and, disregarding his mistress' sharp "Come here, Nero," walked to meet him. A moment later he was nuzzling Smith's pockets for sugar. "I wish you wouldn't," she began, and then stopped. "Wish I wouldn't what?" he smiled. "You make him so disobedient with sugar," she replied. "Your mistress implies that you do not love me for myself alone," said Smith, lifting the horse's muzzle from the region of his pockets and gazing into his large, liquid eyes. Nero stretched forward and nibbled Smith's ear. "You see," laughed Smith, "he denies it," and he drew 3 lumps of sugar from his pocket and held them out to Nero, who proceeded to crunch them contentedly. "Have you seen Eric?" Marjorie enquired, as she rose and glanced at her wrist watch, a little impatiently he thought. "I was to meet him here at 4 o'clock. I'm afraid he has been getting into mischief again, he was so mysterious about it." In his surprise, Smith was on the point of telling her that he too had an appointment with Eric by the edge of Buckdale Wood. Fortunately he realised in time that Eric had merely taken another step towards ensuring continuous fast bowling practice. "Eric?" he repeated vaguely. "I saw him this morning." He in turn glanced at his watch. It was 4:15. There was a short silence, which Nero occupied in a further investigation of Smith's pockets. He was by no means sure that the bonanza of sugar had yet been exhausted, and he was right. Marjorie caught the reins and gave them a tug. Nero blew through his lips as if in protest at such selfishness. "Oh, please make him come away, Mr. Warren," she pleaded. "I hate hurting him. Nero, don't be so naughty." She made another effort to pull his head from the vicinity of Smith's pockets. Then suddenly she laughed. Smith glanced down at her, surprise in his eyes. "It's so absurd," she cried. "Unless you do something, or I hurt Nero, it seems as if we shall both be here for the rest of the day." Without a word, Smith drew 4 more lumps of sugar from his pocket, which Nero fastened upon in a flash. "That's all," he cried. "If you see Eric, will you tell him I've gone home?" said Marjorie, as she walked to Nero's side. "He may have been detained," suggested Smith tentatively. She hesitated. "It's only 20 minutes past 4," he added, intent upon following up the advantage he felt he had gained. "No more," he cried, as Nero, having eaten the 4 lumps of sugar he had just received, was preparing for further investigation. Smith turned his coat pockets inside out. With a snort of contempt, Nero turned aside and proceeded to make pretence of grazing. "Don't you think Nero might be permitted to finish his meal?" he suggested tentatively. "He eats too much," she said with a little smile. As she spoke she looked across at her favourite, who was moving from spot to spot, taking a nibble here and a nibble there with the daintiness of a Victorian belle. "Perhaps grass is an antidote for sugar," suggested Smith gravely. She glanced at him quickly to see if he were serious. "Couldn't you just sit down just for 10 minutes?" he said tentatively. "I rather want to " He paused. "Perhaps Eric has been detained," he added hastily. She turned to the tree trunk, reseating herself where he had found her. He selected the least uncomfortable spot that the irregularities of the fallen monarch presented, and followed suit. He had longed for an opportunity such as this, and now it had presented itself, he was at a loss what to say. In spite of himself, he smiled. Marjorie too was wondering why she had so meekly accepted the invitation of the man she had, in her own mind, vowed to avoid. She had found a certain embarrassment in his silence. At his smile she turned on him a look of interrogation. A sudden Puck-like instinct prompted him to tell her the truth. "I was wondering why I asked you to sit down," he said, keeping his gaze on the pond, upon which no ripple broke the glass-like surface. Her eyes widened slightly. His remark was so unexpected. "Was it not to wait for Eric?" she enquired, with perfect self-possession. She continued to regard him steadily. He could have sworn that, just for the fraction of a second, there was a flash of mischief in her eyes; but it was gone in an instant. "It sounded worse than it really was," he said with a smile, as he drew out his cigarette case and proffered it to her. She made a movement of refusal and, a moment later, inclined her head slightly to the question in his eyes, as he half drew a cigarette from the case. With great deliberation he proceeded to light it. "I suppose what I really wanted," he said, throwing away the match, "was a quiet talk, without the feeling that at any moment you could flick Nero's rein and disappear." "But you're not sure?" she queried gravely. "Emotionally, I am never sure of anything," he replied. "That is the woman in me." "You are frank, at least." The even tone of her voice irritated him. "Is that a quality or a defect?" he enquired. "Need we analyse everything?" she countered. "When I was first misidentified," he said, ignoring the question, and gazing at the blue spiral that rose through the still air from his cigarette, "I asked Willis what he would do if he were suddenly accused of being the Lord High Admiral of Timbuctoo, or some such place, I forget the exact locality. His reply was that he would produce people to prove that he was Lady Warren's butler." He paused, but as she showed no inclination to speak, merely sitting with the air of one who is politely interested, he continued. "That shows Willis to be a man capable of rising to a great occasion," he continued. The answer was obviously correct. It indicated the only possible course open to him in the light of such a contingency. Her instinct was to ask why he did not profit by such wisdom, particularly as he believed in it, but she remained silent. "Nero!" she called, as he showed a tendency to explore too large a tract of turf. Obedient to her voice, there being no sugar to lure him from his allegiance, he turned and proceeded to graze towards where they were sitting. "Do you ever do things for which you can find no reasonable explanation?" he enquired. It was most infernally awkward approaching a difficult subject with one who gave you no help. She started slightly at the question. She could find no reasonable excuse for sitting on a tree trunk within a few feet of a man whom she was pledged cordially to dislike, as she told herself she did a dozen times a day. "Sometimes," she conceded, her eyes following the slow and deliberate movements of the contented Nero, who from time to time cast an inquiring glance in her direction, as if to assure himself that she were still there. "That is the case with me at the present moment," he said quietly. "I don't know why I am here. No, I don't mean here on this old tree," he added hurriedly, as she made a movement as if to rise. "I mean in Little Bilstead." For the first time she looked interested, at the same time puzzled by his remark. "Do you really think," he continued, "that any self-respecting man would deliberately endeavour to be taken for Alfred Warren?" He paused, and as she remained silent he went on. "Even Willis found it difficult to camouflage the spots of the family leopard. When I asked him a few leading questions about my alleged past, it was quite a picture to see him struggling between loyalty to the family and a truthful upbringing." Still she made no reply. "Then there's that dear old creature of a nurse, who insists on delving into the past with which I am credited, for reminiscences of the most intimate and embarrassing nature concerned with what happened a quarter of a century ago." This time Marjorie smiled. She had bitten her underlip until it was sore. The picture of Mrs. Higgs, as she had appeared the night of Smith's arrival, was too irresistibly funny even for her present mood of austerity. "Can you imagine any man," he persisted, "deliberately assuming the rather murky past of another for no conceivable reason?" He paused for her to reply. "Frankly, I cannot," she said simply. "And yet that is what you attribute to me," he continued. "According to all I hear, it even involves danger to life and limb." He flicked the ash from his cigarette with a mechanical fourth finger, a habit he had contracted in the trenches. "If you are not Mr. Warren," she began in a low, even tone, "don't you think you have been a little cruel?" "Cruel!" he exclaimed, startled. "Cruel to whom?" "To Lady Warren," was the quiet reply. "No doubt half a dozen people have written telling her that her son has returned and " "Good Lord!" he cried. "I hadn't thought of that." He watched her as, with a twig, she picked at a piece of moss on the tree trunk. "But they don't know her address," he protested, with the air of one seeking to defend himself against what he knows to be a just charge. "That would not prevent certain people writing," she said, and he noticed that she stressed the certain ever so slightly. "They know she is staying in Cape Town, and a letter addressed to the shipping company on whose boat she travelled would reach her." "I hadn't thought of that," said Smith, tossing away his half smoked cigarette and proceeding to light another. Here was an entirely new factor in a situation that was already rich in embarrassments. "Do you think I ought to go away at once?" he asked, conscious of the unreasoning eagerness with which he awaited her reply. "That is not a subject on which I can advise," she said gravely. "Why?" "Because I do not know all there is to know," she replied simply. He was conscious that she had thawed somewhat, that her manner was less unsympathetic. For nearly a minute there was silence, broken at length by Smith. "I want to ask you a question," he said. "Yes?" She turned to him with slightly lifted brows. "Do you really think that I am Alfred Warren, knowing what you do about him, and having seen what you have of me?" He gazed steadily into her eyes. "Every one recognises you as Mr. Warren," she replied after a short pause. There was a note of hesitation in her voice. "Yes, but you?" he persisted. I " She stopped short. "It is impossible for me to say," and her eyes dropped before his intense gaze. "Does that mean that in your heart you don't?" he asked, in his eagerness leaning slightly towards her. "Please!" There was genuine distress both in her tone and her look as she lifted her eyes once more to his, her red moist lips slightly parted. "I thought women always knew such things by intuition," he said, half to himself. She continued to regard him, a puzzled look in her eyes. It was as if she were seeking to draw something from him without the aid of speech. She was conscious that her reason had never been less in control of the situation. "If you are not Mr. Warren," she said at length, speaking slowly and deliberately, "why do you not say who you are?" "Because," he paused, "because there are reasons why I prefer to be known as James Smith," he said quietly, conscious that, in spite of his endeavour to keep his tone friendly, there was an implied snub in his words. She rose and called to Nero. "I must go now," she said. A few moments later she was in the saddle, Nero impatiently pawing the ground. She hesitated before giving the signal that would take them careering over the countryside. Smith looked up at her curiously. It seemed as if she wished to say something, which she found some difficulty in putting into words. "I think I ought to tell you," she said at length. "Robert Thirkettle is coming back." In spite of himself, Smith started. The remark was so entirely unexpected. She was gazing down at him, the same look in her eyes that he had noticed before, as if she would penetrate behind the veil of his words. "When?" he asked at length, conscious that the question might easily be translated into anxiety. "This week." "How do you know?" "The groom, Nudd, told me in confidence," she added, flushing slightly. "His father told him. No one else knows." "And why do you tell me?" Smith enquired, conscious that there was a note of sternness in his voice. "I thought you might want to." Her eyes dropped beneath the anger that blazed in his. A moment later Nero was outraged by feeling the touch of the light riding switch she always carried. He plunged forward, angry that his sugar man should have seen him subjected to so great an indignity. As they disappeared from sight, Smith returned to the fallen tree, where he proceeded to fill his pipe, a stern, uncompromising look in his usually smiling blue eyes. "Damn Alfred Warren!" he muttered. "Is it all right?" A red head was poked out from behind a hedge a few yards away. "If I catch you," cried Smith angrily, looking about him for the head that had disappeared at the first sign of danger, "I'll toss you into the pond," and he made a dive for a clump of bushes next to the one from which Eric was in a rapid but orderly retreat. "Marjie's given him a chill on the liver," he muttered philosophically a minute later, as he took a pot shot at a robin on a hawthorn tree. "What price my bowling prac now?" Chapter 19 of The Return of Alfred by Herbert George Jenkins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 19. Sir John Hildreth inserts an advertisement. 1. "Is this your doing, John?" Mrs. Compton Stacey held out to her brother a copy of the Times folded so as to give prominence to the agony column, at the same time pointing to an advertisement which read: "James Smith. Wanted news of one calling himself James Smith, known to be an alias, last seen in the neighbourhood of Winchester on June 23rd, with suitcase, kit bag and raincoat. Age 28. Height 5 feet 10 inches. Fair, blue eyes, attractive personality. A reward of £25 will be paid for news that will lead to the discovery of the present whereabouts of the said James Smith. Apply to Truelove and Murchison, Solicitors, 384 Lincoln's Inn Fields, London, W.C." "Well, what's the matter with it?" demanded Sir John Hildreth, with the truculence of one who already stands self-condemned. "Is Mr. Murchison responsible for the literary part?" enquired Mrs. Compton Stacey as she replaced the paper on the table. "No, he's not," was the curt reply. "I'm not a fool that I have to go to my solicitor to draw up an advertisement." "You composed it yourself, then?" she queried. "Of course I did," he retorted. "I got it out of a book. At least, I got the idea," he added. "A novel?" she queried, with that quiet insistence which always gave her brother the feeling that he was once more a schoolboy sent up before the head. "It was a story I was reading." Sir John was an inveterate reader of novels of the more sensational order. "Of course I altered it." Mrs. Compton Stacey rose and walked over to her brother's favourite chair, on which was lying a book. Picking it up, she read aloud the title, "The Bloodstained Boot." Opening it at a place where a leaf was turned down, she glanced first at the page before her, then at her brother, who stood with guilt stamped all over him. Finally she returned to the page. "The adaptation is admirable," she said a few minutes later as she returned to her chair, carrying the book with her. "But the advertisement in the book concerns a man suspected of murder," she added as she resumed her seat. "Unfortunately you have retained the same atmosphere in your own wording." "There's nothing about murder," he cried, unable to keep out of his voice the apprehension he felt. "It simply offers a reward for news of Darrell." "Well, we shall see," she said, with the air of one who herself has no doubt whatever about the matter. "An advertisement like that may make things extremely awkward for the boy." "How?" he demanded, now thoroughly disconcerted. "At Scotland Yard, I believe, they are inveterate readers of newspapers. The implication of the words 'calling himself' and 'alias' is clearly that of fraud." "But I didn't say so," he cried, seizing the Times, reading the advertisement again, and finally tossing the paper back upon the table, after which he stood staring blankly at his sister. "You had better marry Vera Truscombe, John," she said, nodding her head slightly, which with her always indicated disapproval. "Better a crinkled nose in a wife than a crinkled brain in a bachelor." "I won't be bullied like this, Charlotte," he blazed. "You disapprove of everything I do. You " "And who is generally right?" she enquired calmly. "You or I?" "Confound it! I refuse to discuss the matter with you," he cried angrily, putting up a barrage of wrath to hide his discomfiture. "Why didn't you say all this before I sent off those infernal advertisements? I put it in the Morning Post and the Daily Telegraph too. You always blame me after it's done." "For one thing, I was not aware that you intended to advertise," she said, rising. Her calmness on such occasions infuriated him. "And for another " "It was you who told me to do it," he interrupted. "And for another," she continued imperturbably, "you seldom, if ever, take advice, John. You prefer to allow me to help pick up the pieces afterwards." "But didn't you advise me to advertise for him?" he demanded, planting himself directly in her path to the door. "To the best of my recollection," she said as she made a detour round him, "you remarked that you would be damned if you did." And as she passed she gave him a little smile which told him that they were still friends. Without that smile he would have been wretched for the rest of the day, although he did not know it. "Damn that fellow Peters!" he grumbled as he closed the door. "What the devil did he want to grow that infernal moustache for? If he'd been here " He did not finish the sentence, but threw himself into his chair, and glared at the bust of Disraeli. Then suddenly he recollected that he had not told his sister of his master stroke in writing to Peters. The thought of it soothed his wounded feelings, and, rising, he mixed himself a whisky and soda. 2. "Jane!" In her excitement Miss Mary started forward and, with the edge of the Morning Post, upset her coffee cup. Miss Jell slightly lowered the Times (she always read the Times at breakfast) and gazed disapprovingly across at her sister. "Ring the bell, Mary," she said, "and tell the maid to bring a cloth." Miss Jell prided herself upon her restraint even in moments of crisis. It annoyed her intensely for any one to soil a tablecloth, but the act once committed, she accepted it with stoical calm, which she considered was due to her self respect as a gentlewoman. "But look, Jane!" cried Miss Mary, and she held out the copy of the Morning Post, indicating the agony column with a mal manicured forefinger. "It's him!" she cried ungrammatically. Then, her eyes falling on the dark stain which was slowly spreading, she dashed over to the bell push and pressed it. "Miss Mary has had an accident," said Miss Jell with cold composure as the maid entered. Miss Jell always referred to her as the maid, For one thing, it was more refined, and for another, she did not approve of the nomenclature of the lower orders. "Dab it gently, and then put a dinner mat underneath," she ordered. Having provided for the crisis which her sister's impetuosity had precipitated, Miss Jell turned to the newspaper that had been thrust into her hands. "It's in the agony column," cried Miss Mary, hardly able to control her voice. "The third down. Isn't it dreadful?" Miss Jell lowered her eyes and read: "James Smith. Wanted news of one calling himself James Smith, known to be an alias, last seen in the neighbourhood of Winchester on June 23rd, with suitcase, kit bag and rain coat. Age 28, height 5 feet 10 inches, fair, with blue eyes, attractive personality. A reward of £25 will be paid for news that will lead to the discovery of the present whereabouts of the said James Smith. Apply to Truelove and Murchison, Solicitors, 384 Lincoln's Inn Fields, London, W.C." Having read the advertisement twice, Miss Jell returned the paper to her sister. Composure was another quality upon which she prided herself. "What do you think, Jane?" asked Miss Mary, quivering with excitement, which she controlled with difficulty, knowing her sister's prejudice against any expression of emotion. "I think it most deplorable, Mary. The man is obviously a bad character, whether he is Alfred Warren or not." But " Miss Mary paused, and looked anxiously at her sister. "Well?" Miss Jell lifted her chin slightly. Miss Mary recognised it as a danger signal. "Nothing, Jane," she stuttered. "Say what you were going to say, Mary," ordered Miss Jell. "I I was only going to mention that there is a reward." The last three words came out with a rush, and Miss Mary held her breath. "There is a reward for those who choose to claim it," was the icy rejoinder, and the vision of the new dining room carpet that had floated before Miss Mary's eyes vanished. She sighed, realising that somebody else in Little Bilstead would inevitably acquire what she had already come to look upon as the property of the Cedars. During the rest of the meal each was unusually preoccupied, Miss Mary in condoling with herself over the loss of a dining room carpet, Miss Jell in wrestling with her breeding. Just at the moment when she arrived at the conclusion that it was the duty of every British subject to assist in bringing a criminal to justice, Miss Marshall was engaged in slapping her father vigorously between his shoulder blades. It was Mr. Marshall's practice at breakfast to prop the Daily Telegraph up in front of him. He generally used the coffee pot for the purpose. During the whole of the meal his eyes were seldom removed from its columns. Food he conveyed to his mouth mechanically, and he would drink, absorbing the news of the world over the rim of his cup. It was this custom that had brought about disaster. The self-same advertisement that had caused Miss Mary Jell to upset her coffee cup had met the eye of Mr. Marshall just as he was swallowing, with the result that a portion of the weak tea with which he washed down his frugal breakfast had, as he explained later to his daughter, "gone the wrong way." When Mr. Marshall had acquired a working supply of oxygen, he pointed to the paragraph which had caused all the trouble. His throat was too sore for speech. "Father!" cried Miss Marshall, having read the advertisement, which she promptly translated into a pair of trousers, a blouse, and a new dinner service, respectively for her father, herself, and the house, with a handsome balance to be allocated later. "A pen and ink," gasped Mr. Marshall. The word "ink" came out like an order from a drill sergeant as Mr. Marshall trailed off into another paroxysm of coughing, and Miss Marshall went to do her parents' bidding. 4 other breakfast tables in Little Bilstead were that morning rendered intensely dramatic by the announcement that news of James Smith was so eagerly desired as to be worth the sum of £25 to the advertiser. By 10 o'clock quite a number of interested people were aware that James Smith was wanted, and not being overburdened with charity, they assumed the worst. Tom Bassingthwaighte heard it from Mrs. Crane's maid, who had noticed that Dr. Crane's attention was divided between the agony column of the Times and removing the bones of a bloater from his mouth with his fingers. She had overheard a remark he had made to Mrs. Crane in which the word "reward" had been mentioned. Having a good sight, she had managed to read the advertisement over the doctor's shoulder, and, having no arrière pensée, she had confided the news to Tom Bassingthwaighte when he brought the letters. That morning very few people got their due as the post office understood it, although many received letters to which they were not entitled. Tom Bassingthwaighte was doing some deep thinking instead of devoting his entire attention to His Majesty's mails. It was not until he reached the vicarage, which lay towards the end of his round, that he saw his way clear. Inspiration came in the shape of little Bobby Grieve, who was hastening towards him with the vicar's morning paper. "You be late, Bobby," remarked Tom Bassingthwaighte pleasantly. "Slep over myself," panted the breathless Bobby. "I'll take it up," said the postman good naturedly, relieving the lad of the vicarage copy of the Times. With a suppressed explosion which really meant "Thanks," Bobby darted off. It was when he was half way up the drive that Tom Bassingthwaighte had his inspiration. He had already realised the danger of this fugitive from justice, as in his own mind he already classified Smith, making a bolt of it. If the vicarage received no paper that morning, this danger would be removed, or at least considerably lessened, as it was very unlikely that anyone would warn Smith that a price was upon his head. They would prefer to make an effort to obtain the reward. Tom Bassingthwaighte had lived too long in Little Bilstead to be in any doubt as to the characters of its inhabitants. Feeling like a detective in one of the paper covered stories upon which he fed ravenously, the postman thrust the copy of the Times into his bag. From then on everybody got their proper ration of correspondence. The postman knew that in Little Bilstead they were inveterate readers of newspapers. He foresaw a number of applications for the reward, and it perturbed him. That fact had been responsible for the mistakes in distribution. By 3 o'clock that afternoon his worst forebodings were realised, as there were no less than 9 letters addressed to the Messrs. Truelove and Murchison, his own being the 10th. With great deliberation he placed these 9 letters under the counter, letting the 10th go forward. There were times, he reasoned, when postal delays were unavoidable. That night at The Pigeons it was noticed that Tom Bassingthwaighte was in a state of high good humour. He drank 2 ciders, 3 old ales, and sang 1 song, eventually returning home at an hour that augured ill for the punctual delivery of the morrow's letters. When Smith walked through the village that morning, he was conscious that he was arousing more than usual interest. The sporting element was still as cordial in its greetings, whilst the unsporting scowled at him as darkly as ever. Still, he was conscious of an atmosphere of suppressed excitement, and he was puzzled. It was possible, of course, that some hitherto unsuspected misdemeanour of Alfred Warren had been unearthed, in which case the explosion would probably take place later. He noticed among other things that Postle was in full uniform, with carefully blackened boots. It was a tradition in Little Bilstead that for John Postle to blacken his boots boded ill for somebody. It was his method of emphasizing the fact that dramatic events were pending. For some days past Smith had been debating upon the advisability of continuing his journey. The railway strike had ended in a compromise, as such things invariably do, after all the damage has been done. There were many reasons why he would have liked to stay in Little Bilstead, not the least of which was the fact that it provided both comedy and drama, with a special tendency towards the unexpected. As he approached The Pigeons, he observed John Nudd, who was standing at the door, suddenly turn and bolt into the inn, as if undesirous of being recognised. As a matter of fact, he had just remembered leaving the newspaper on the counter, and, as he had already written and posted an application for the £25 reward, he was not taking any chances. Reappearing as Smith came past the door, he nodded and proceeded to watch him until he was out of sight up the road. Smith finally decided that the secret of Thirkettle's return had leaked out and was responsible for the electricity in the atmosphere. That day Smith was late for luncheon. He had walked on, forgetful of the time, as he pondered Marjorie's words. Had he been cruel in staying on? He had suggested the possibility to Miss Lipscombe the night before at dinner, and she had replied "Rubbish," proceeding to point out that even if he had gone at once the damage was already done. "Marjorie's too young to understand," had been her final comment. He had wondered. Chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Return of Alfred by Herbert George Jenkins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 20. Little Bilstead aches with drama. 1. "Mr. Willis would like to see you, sir." "Willis?" repeated Smith, looking from Janet across the luncheon table to Miss Lipscombe. At the slight inclination of her head, he rose. In the hall he found Willis, his face deathly white, the corners of his mouth twitching, and his hands working as if he were unable to control them. "Is anything the matter, Willis?" he enquired, hastening across to the butler. "Bob Thirkettle's back, Mr. Alfred," he stuttered, and the trembling of his hands and the twitching of his mouth seemed to increase. "I've run all the way from The Grange to warn you, sir." "That was very foolish," said Smith gravely. "Why should you want to warn me?" "You mustn't go out, sir," he quavered huskily. "He'll kill you, sir." He swayed slightly and appeared to be on the point of collapse. "Sit down, Willis," said Smith gently, forcing him into a chair. "You look thoroughly ill." "I'm all right, Mr. Alfred, thank you," he stuttered, giving the lie to his words by the greyness of his features and the beads of perspiration on his brow. "Ask Miss Lipscombe if she'll come here," said Smith, turning to Janet, who stood an open-mouthed spectator. "And bring some brandy." A minute later Miss Lipscombe had taken the matter in hand and was holding a glass of brandy and water to Willis' grey lips. Slowly he drank, with the obedience of a child. Presently he sighed and the colour returned to his cheeks. He strove to rise, but Miss Lipscombe restrained him. "Now sit still, Willis," she said gently, "and do as you are told. I will send Janet for Dr. Crane." "No, miss, please don't, miss," he expostulated. "It's only a passing faintness. I've been hurrying," he gasped, his gaze all the time fixed fearfully upon Smith. "Dear me, dear me," murmured the vicar, appearing at the dining room door, his vague eyes resting upon Willis, sitting limply in the chair. "It must be the hot weather." "Rubbish," was Miss Lipscombe's comment. "When a man of Willis' age will run about the countryside as he says he has been doing, what do you expect?" The vicar continued to gaze at the inert form of the butler, mild reproach in his eye. "Very wrong," he murmured. "Very dangerous, too. I was once excellent at the sprint myself; but not now," he murmured sadly. "Not now." "If you go trotting about like a 2-year-old, Willis," said Smith, "we shall have you taking to your bed, and then what will everybody do at The Grange?" "It was Mrs. Higgs sent me," murmured Willis. "She's having hysterics," he added, with the air of one who announces that another is taking a bath. "Mrs. Death had a vision last night," he added gravely. "So we were " He stopped suddenly, his eyes fixed appealingly upon Smith. The corners of Miss Lipscombe's mouth twitched, as she made a motion to her brother to return to the dining room. For a moment the vicar stood regarding her uncertainly, then, having looked behind him, and on either side, to see if there were anyone to whom she was signalling, he realised her sign was for him, and turned obediently into the dining room, followed by his sister and Janet. "Mr. Alfred," whispered Willis, having assured himself by a hasty glance that the dining room door was closed. "Don't go into the village to day, sir. If you do, Bob Thirkettle will oh, it's terrible," he broke off, moaning. "Don't you worry your foolish old head about me, Willis," said Smith with a reassuring smile, "and tell Mrs. Higgs I'll bring her the redoubtable Thirkettle's head on a salver." "You won't go, Mr. Alfred, will you?" he begged. He threatened to kill you, sir." "So I understand." "And he's so strong, sir." "Is he? By the way, Willis, has it ever struck you that two can play at the killing game?" "But, Mr. Alfred, you wouldn't have a chance with him," he quavered. He may have his gun." "So you expect me to stay in the grounds and never go out, Willis?" Smith queried, smiling down at him. "Is that it?" "Yes, sir, it would be safer," counselled Willis. "It would certainly be safer," he agreed, "but would it be altogether dignified, do you think?" Willis' eyes dropped beneath Smith's gaze. There was about him nothing of the paladin. "You won't go out, Mr. Alfred, will you?" he implored, rising shakily from his chair. "I must get back to Mrs. Higgs, sir. Miss Marjorie's out, and Mrs. Death may have another vision, sir, and there's no one to look after things." He tottered towards the hall door. "I'll come part of the way with you," said Smith, taking the old man gently by the arm. A vision seeing cook was a bit of a responsibility, he decided. At the vicarage gate Willis insisted that he was quite well again, and as he seemed able to get on alone, Smith retraced his steps to the vicarage. He was not feeling so easy in his own mind as his words implied. It was a beastly awkward situation, he decided. If he did not appear in the village, or go about the neighbourhood as usual, people would inevitably say that he was afraid. If, on the other hand, he did appear, there would undoubtedly be a row. Thirkettle might even attempt to shoot him. Quite apart from that, however, the fellow appeared to have a big reputation as a fighter. The worst of it was, Smith found his sympathies entirely with his self-constituted enemy. The man was acting only as a man should act under such provocation as he had received. The unfortunate thing was that the real Alfred was not there to receive the chastisement he so richly deserved. It was obvious that he must go down to the village and show himself, otherwise he would be branded as a craven, and he felt he should be making a poor return for the hospitality he had received at the Grange if he allowed such a stigma to rest upon Lady Warren's reputed son. As he re-entered the dining room, he heard the vicar say, "They must shake hands, Hannah." "Shake fiddlesticks! You " She stopped suddenly at the sight of Smith. "You know?" he queried, as he resumed his seat at the table. She nodded. "Janet told us," she said. In her eyes there was a strange expression that puzzled him. It suggested both anxiety and expectation. He was conscious that she was watching him keenly. As for Janet, each time she had occasion to enter the room, she fixed on Smith a pair of round, terrified eyes, and her gaze did not leave his face until interrupted by the closing of the door behind her. "I think," said Miss Lipscombe, after an almost embarrassing silence, "that it would be better to let the vicar see Postle before you go into the village." "I am going to the village this afternoon, Miss Lipscombe," he said quietly, replacing his coffee cup in the saucer. He could have sworn that the look which sprang into Miss Lipscombe's eyes was one of relief. For nearly a minute she continued to regard him steadily. "This Thirkettle is a big man, Mr. Smith," she said at length, "and he has reason " She hesitated. "So I understand," was his calm retort. "I have made some excellent friends owing to my likeness to Alfred Warren, and I must not refuse to encounter one of his enemies. It wouldn't be quite cricket," he smiled. "Would it now?" "And you really mean to go?" "Even with you and the vicar hanging on to my coat tails," he smiled. This time there was no doubt about the look in Miss Lipscombe's eyes. It was relief. She had dreaded finding the feet of clay she expected to be there. "It is very difficult to know what to do," she murmured, looking across at the vicar, who was dreamily gazing out of the window. "Very difficult," she repeated, shaking her head slightly as she rose from the table. "I think I'll finish training that rather self-willed Dorothy Perkins," said Smith as he, too, rose. "Another hour ought to bring her to reason," he added. He had no intention of placing himself at a disadvantage by joining issue with the local Dempsey immediately after a meal. A little relaxation with Dorothy Perkins would make all the difference in his speed, and from what he had heard, it was in speed alone that his chance lay, provided of course it came to blows. Dorothy Perkins took rather longer than the hour he had allotted to her. Moreover, she was spiteful and pricked his fingers. It was not until 3 o'clock that he went to his room to change into an easy jacket and a pair of rubber-soled tennis shoes. There was nothing like being prepared. Slipping out of the back way, he made a detour round the house and struck the drive half-way towards the gate. As he did so, he caught a glimpse of Marjorie disappearing round the bend in the direction of the vicarage. Had she, too, come to warn him against the danger that threatened? His jaw set in a grim line. To inherit another man's sins was bad enough, but to be credited with his cowardice was intolerable. As he strode along the road towards the village, he almost hoped that Bob Thirkettle would show fight. It was his intention to take a stroll through the village for half a mile and return the same way. This would give his man time to appear. Of course Thirkettle might prefer the infinitely surer way of potting him from behind a friendly hedge, but he must take his chance of that. Still, it was not a pleasant sensation walking along a highway with the knowledge that, somewhere in the near vicinity, was a man thirsting for your blood, a man who at any moment might be gazing along the barrel of a gun preparatory to letting fly. As he walked, his thoughts drifted back to his Oxford days, when Old Plum, an ex-prize fighter, would mix it with anyone who made it worth his while. "Give and take, gentlemen, if you please," had been the burden of his exhortation, "and don't be afraid of the ginger." As Old Plum himself gave considerably more ginger than he took, his clientele was recruited exclusively from the hardiest and the heaviest of the year's boxing men. Suddenly Smith was startled by a small boy darting out from the hedge some 50 yards or so ahead, and scuttling off for all he was worth along the road. "A jackal," he murmured. "Thank the Lord for Old Plum." 2. The news of Bob Thirkettle's return had spread through Little Bilstead with almost incredible rapidity. It had found Mr. Marshall going over the leg bone of a rabbit with his back teeth, Miss Marshall watching him anxiously lest it should slip from his grasp. She was always anxious when her father got to the bones, especially fish bones. Mr. Marshall hurried over the boiled suet pudding in a way that convinced his daughter he would have indigestion. This would mean a sleepless night for her, for with Mr. Marshall indigestion was a vocal affair of agonized octaves. After a final look round to see that there was nothing further to devour, he hastened down to the village to buy a stamp. To Little Bilstead, Tom Bassingthwaighte was what a tape machine is to a London club, the centre of interest in times of crisis. By a strange coincidence, Miss Mary Jell, on hearing the news, also found herself out of stamps, and was promptly forbidden to go near the village until the danger was over. Never had she felt more like rebellion. For the first time in her placid and docile existence, she realised the disadvantages of a sheltered life. She knew that her sister would go into the village to see that everything was as it should be. Miss Jell was like that. She would eat plums when they first came in to see if they were ripe, and then forbid her sister to touch one for fear of cholera. How wonderful it must be to be wicked, was Miss Mary's half-expressed thought as she picked up her knitting needles and proceeded with what Miss Jell always referred to as a garment. To Miss Jell all such things were garments, without amplification, except when absolutely necessary. The news caught Colonel Enderby bolting curry, his bald head dotted with moisture. He both took and gave things that were hot. Of social Little Bilstead he was first upon the scene, for, being an Anglo Indian, he ate curry with spoon and fork, which considerably increased the rate of intake. "What's the meaning of this, Postle?" he barked, as he overtook the constable, with his newly polished boots, just outside the village. Postle halted, turned, and gaped, in one and the same movement. The Colonel, as he called him, always had the same effect upon the Little Bilstead policeman, seeming to petrify him. "Well, confound you, can't you answer?" he shouted. The curry had not settled down as it should. "I see Tom Simmons, I did," Postle spluttered, "and he said to me, 'John, that there Bob Thirkettle'll be back,' so I—" "Be damned to you!" shouted the Colonel, as he strode angrily on, leaving the gaping Postle to follow at his own pace. He had never been able to settle down to the detailed narrative style of the Norfolk rustic. At the sight of his natural enemy stalking towards the post office, Tom Bassingthwaighte scuttled to cover like a frightened rabbit, leaving his sister to bear the brunt of the explosion he knew was coming. The Colonel might threaten to report her, but, even if she heard, she would take no notice. The demand for stamps that day, in small numbers and of small denominations, constituted a record, beating by 3 halfpence the previous highest total, achieved on the morning following the sudden and unexpected appearance of Smith. The fact that Tom Bassingthwaighte had "gone to earth" was as great a disappointment to Little Bilstead as it was to him. but the Colonel might return at any moment, and the village postman was frankly afraid of his bark. Once in the village, social Little Bilstead was rather at a loss what to do. It could not go on buying stamps, for which it had ostensibly come. Miss Jell alone showed any originality. She bought some matches, which she did not want, and a periodical she had no intention of reading. Mrs. Truspitt Greene and Mrs. Crane arrived together, but from different ends of the village. 5 minutes later, Mrs. Spelman, with a very red face and no breath, was seen making for the post office at what was practically the double. She had been the last to hear the news, but she had got off with a flying start and odd shoes. She alone of all her set made no pretence of wanting stamps. She came for scandal, bloodshed if possible, but certainly scandal. "What do you think of it?" she panted, as she rushed up to Miss Jell, who had adopted the tactics of walking slowly through the village and back, as if she had been a seaside flapper and Little Bilstead the front. Miss Jell gazed coldly at Mrs. Spelman's flushed features. Without waiting for a reply or a further supply of breath, Mrs. Spelman plunged on. "I only heard 10 minutes ago. Have you seen them? Isn't it dreadful? I shall scream if he brings a gun. Where's Postle? It will be in all the papers. What a scandal! Have they warned him?" She looked about her at the little group of villagers and at the larger group in front of The Pigeons. The air was electrical. People talked in hushed voices, and glanced continually in the direction which any one coming from the vicarage must take. Within 5 minutes Mrs. Spelman had proved a rallying point. Throwing overboard the postage stamp camouflage, social Little Bilstead gathered about her and talked. Colonel Enderby threw out denunciations like squibs. Mr. Marshall, who had now been joined by his daughter, listened with his mouth. Mrs. Truspitt Greene ascribed the tragedy they all foresaw to the will of the Almighty. Miss Jell was restrained almost to the point of screaming. Mrs. Crane looked on and, in consequence, saw most of the game, whilst from behind a tree in the distance Miss Mary Jell gazed longingly towards what was to her a land of promise. Everybody wondered what had become of Postle. Colonel Enderby announced his intention of reporting him by telephone to the Chief Commissioner at Scotland Yard. In the meantime the village constable was drinking a mug of ale in the private parlour of The Pigeons. Opposite him sat a big black bearded man, with lowering brow and sullen smouldering eye. "Now, Bob, I can't have no shooting, bor," Postle remarked as he replaced his empty mug upon the table. "There 'ont be no shooting," growled the bearded man, "but there may be bloody murder for all that," and he picked up his mug and drained it at a draught. 3. "Here he be! Here he be!" A small boy was running down the hill at breakneck speed towards the village, shouting as he ran. A thrill passed through the little groups. Every head was turned in the direction from which the boy was running. There was a movement among the crowd outside The Pigeons. A silence fell upon every one, only the shuffling of feet upon the gritty road was to be heard. Suddenly there was a murmur, a sort of moan of expectancy, such as preludes the cheers with which a boat race is acclaimed. All eyes were directed towards the top of the hill, down which the boy was running. There was a gasp, a catching of many breaths, as Smith appeared round the bend, smoking his cigarette and walking as if nothing had happened, or was likely to happen. Why he had lighted the cigarette he did not know. Probably for the same reason that the hero in a melodrama falls back upon tobacco when the villain has him at a disadvantage. It emphasized the indifference he was far from feeling. In spite of his apparent unconcern, Smith was a little staggered at the sight the village street presented. It seemed as if the whole population had turned out in his honour. It removed from his mind the last vestige of a doubt that he was on the eve of dramatic developments. As he approached, he noticed a movement among those gathered outside The Pigeons. A moment later a heavily built, dark whiskered man came out. For a moment he stood looking about him. Then with a curious shambling gait like the lope of a bear, he proceeded to walk in the direction from which Smith was approaching. Immediately behind him came Nudd, with Tom Simmons in attendance. The crowd also got in motion. As Smith regarded the huge proportions of the man approaching him, he was thankful that he had taken the precaution of changing his boots for shoes. With such an antagonist, he argued, his feet would be of far more use than his hands. Only by nimble footwork could he hope to avoid the onslaught of some 14 or 15 stone of muscle and flesh. If the man were a scientific boxer, then his number was up, he decided. Whatever happened it would have to be short and sharp as far as he was concerned. With outward calm and unconcern he approached the black bearded man, who walked some 4 or 5 yards in front of the crowd. In the excitement of the moment caste was forgotten. Miss Jell found herself clinging to the coat sleeve of Tom Bassingthwaighte, whose teeth were chattering like castanets. Colonel Enderby was craning forward over the head of Millie Marjoram, whilst Mrs. Truspitt Greene, Mrs. Crane, and the Marshalls were wedged in among a group of farmhands. Miss Mary Jell was actually running down the hill towards the scene of the drama. Human frailty had triumphed over her fear of what Jane would say. P.C. Postle was nowhere to be seen. Several intimates had made it clear to him that if he interfered there would be trouble, and he would inevitably be the centre of it. He had therefore wisely decided to leave the pigeons by the back entrance, and at that moment was making a wide detour in the hope of being in at the death. He hated missing the fight, but it was difficult to see how he could stand by and watch what he was paid to prevent from taking place. Smith edged a little to the right, in order to give the man an opportunity of passing him if he were so inclined. Thirkettle, on the other hand, left no doubt in anybody's mind as to his intentions. At the sight of Smith edging away, he evidently thought that he meditated flight. "Look out together," he cried over his shoulder, obviously to friends in the crowd behind. When within a few yards of Thirkettle, Smith stopped, as to continue would have meant running up against him. "So you've returned, Boer," said Thirkettle insolently. Smith eyed him with calm deliberation. "I think you have made a mistake," he remarked quietly. Thirkettle laughed mirthlessly. "So that's your lay, is it?" he cried. "But that can't save you. I suppose you aren't Alfred Warren." Then, with a sudden access of rage, he broke out, "You mucky slink, you know what you done to my poor mawther." Smith flushed slightly at the insolence of the man's tone. Seeing that an encounter was inevitable, he kept a wary eye for a sudden onslaught. "As a matter of fact I am not Mr. Alfred Warren." He laid a slight stress upon the "Mr." "I have never seen you before, and I know nothing about your daughter." Thirkettle hesitated a moment. He seemed nonplussed by Smith's quiet and deliberate manner. He had expected fear, protestations, abjectness. He was puzzled. "You hear 'em together," he cried over his shoulder. There was an ominous murmur from some of those grouped behind him. Turning to Smith once more, he said, "I was going to shoot you as I should have done 7 years ago, but now I'm just going to break every bone in your stinking body." With that he proceeded to take off his coat, with the studied deliberation of a man who knows that his quarry cannot escape him. This he threw on the ground, his hat following. He then began turning up his shirt sleeves. "One moment," said Smith quietly. "I call these people to witness that this dispute has been thrust upon me. Whatever the consequences, the responsibility will lie entirely with you." He looked straight into Thirkettle's blazing eyes. He had scarcely finished speaking before the fellow made a wild rush at him, head down and arms swinging. Although Smith had been speaking to those behind Thirkettle, his eyes had been fixed upon him. Swiftly sidestepping, he let him blunder past. With a feeling of relief, Smith realised that he was opposed to nothing more than brute strength. Stumbling on for 3 or 4 paces before he could stop himself, Thirkettle turned. He appeared surprised that he had not overwhelmed his opponent. Advancing again, more cautiously, he paused for a second. Then, making a sudden dive forward, he swung his right arm with a force that would have stunned an ox, had it landed. Smith ducked and, before his man could recover, had got home with his left between the eyes. Thirkettle staggered and up went his guard, letting in a half-armed right full in the mouth. With a grunt, Thirkettle sat down in the road, gazing about him with eyes that blinked their astonishment. Murmurs rose from the crowd, murmurs of surprise and encouragement, coupled with urgings to Bob Thirkettle to give him the "cosh" he seemed unable to administer, whilst a shrill voice was heard crying, "Do it again! Oh, do it again!" It was Miss Mary Jell, but no one appeared to take any notice. They were too stunned at what had taken place. "Go it, Mist' Alfred!" roared one. Remember Dick Marsh. Don't you be afraid, bor." Miss Jell was now clasping Tom Bassingthwaighte's arm with both hands. Millie Marjoram was gripping Colonel Enderby's hand with moist and trembling fingers. Mrs. Truspitt Greene was making curious little noises at the back of her throat, whilst Mrs. Spelman had just heard herself shout quite loudly, "Kill him! Kill him!" Slowly Thirkettle picked himself up and spat the blood from his mouth. From the look in his eyes it was obvious he had received a severe shock, both physical and mental. For the next few minutes he was caution personified. He seemed dazed. Smith early realised two things. First, that it would be useless to attempt body blows on a man with the physique of a bear. Second, that, unless the whole affair were over quickly, the man's superior strength would wear him down. He therefore decided to force the pace, trusting to his science to make up for the physical disparity. Thirkettle's obvious object was to clinch, and then Smith knew that Queensberry rules would avail him nothing. The man was clearly afraid for his face, his whole scheme of defence being to protect it from another double blow such as he had received. The crowd began to get excited. "Go it, Bob! Give him cosh!" "He's afraid. Remember what he did to your mother," and similar remarks were shouted. For more than a minute the two men moved slowly round, each watching for an opportunity. Thirkettle was endeavouring to manoeuvre Smith into a position where with a mighty rush he could force him into the hedge that bordered the road. Smith recognised that his principal danger lay in the onlookers, who were pressing close upon them. Were he to trip over their friendly or unfriendly limbs, Thirkettle would be upon him in a moment. Suddenly he became aware that the pressure of the crowd had lessened. He heard voices urging the people to stand back. One was shrill and excited, cracking frequently upon the high notes; but he saw nothing. His eyes never left those two smouldering agates of hate, glowering out at him from what looked like a mass of black hair. For nearly 2 minutes Thirkettle continued his cautious tactics. It was obvious that his slow brain was working to find some explanation of what had happened. Smith realised that his opponent would not be able to continue indefinitely such unaccustomed methods, and he watched him narrowly. Several times Thirkettle made clumsy feints, but as Smith was watching his eyes and not his hands, he appeared to take no notice. Emboldened by this fact, he made another sudden dash, this time with his right forearm held high to shield his face. Smith swiftly sidestepped to the left, but by some uncanny instinct Thirkettle seemed to anticipate the move, and the next Smith knew was that what appeared to be a thunderbolt had caught him on the right shoulder, flooring him as if he had been a skittle. Fortunately he had been moving from the blow, the force of which swung Thirkettle round in a half turn; but he was round again in a second. Seeing Smith on the ground, he gave vent to a roar. To him the fight seemed over. Miss Mary screamed, the crowd roared, a shrill voice yelled to Smith to get up. Before Thirkettle realised what was happening, however, Smith was on his feet again and had got home a stinging blow on the side of the enemy's head. The crowd yelled. Never had Little Bilstead known such drama. Smith decided that in forcing the pace with a heavier man it was desirable to be cautious as well as enterprising. Had he been moving towards instead of away from the blow, he would in all probability have lain long enough on the ground to give Thirkettle the chance he sought. Amid a babel of shouts and exhortations, the men fought on, Smith landing blow after blow, until he began to wonder if it were possible to knock out the mountain of flesh and muscle before him. Suddenly he remembered old Plum's recipe for knocking out an unscientific fighter of a heavier weight. "Tap at the front door," he would say, "then down you goes to the basement, and ruddy 'ard," had been his dictum. Leading for the head, Smith got his man on the nose. Up went Thirkettle's guard. It was what Smith was waiting for, the ring at the basement. With a mighty effort he swung his right full at Thirkettle's solar plexus, with all his weight behind the blow. With a sobbing grunt Thirkettle's guard dropped. The first blow had arrested a rush, the second seemed to daze him. Before he had time to recover, Smith landed his left between the eyes, and Thirkettle's guard dropped still lower. With a terrific right hook, Smith got his man on the point of the jaw, and Bob Thirkettle went down like a log. And Little Bilstead went mad for the second time that month. Chapter 21 of The Return of Alfred by Herbert George Jenkins. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21. Marjorie Hears the News. 1. "Marjie! Marjie! Where are you?" Eric dashed across the lawn of the Grange as if the seven deadly sins were pursuing him. Marjorie appeared at the French windows of the morning room, of which she had taken possession since Lady Warren's departure. Eric made towards her at full tilt. She turned back into the grey room out of the sun's glare, Eric following. "Such a fight!" he gasped as he threw himself down into Lady Warren's favourite chair. "A fight?" She turned suddenly. "Who? What?" The colour had left her cheeks. She was conscious that she was trembling. "Smith and Thirk," he panted. "I've run all the way. He paused from sheer lack of oxygen. "Tell me, Eric." She dropped into the nearest chair, conscious of a curious sensation of weakness in her knees. "Tell me, Eric," she repeated, a note of sharpness in her voice. "All right," he panted. "Let a fellow get his wind first. I've run all the way to tell you, and Mrs. Higgs gave me treacle pudding for lunch." Is he hurt?" she interrupted, conscious that even to herself her voice sounded strange. "Hurt?" cried Eric. "You should have seen him, all blood and grunts," and his eyes sparkled at the recollection of the Homeric encounter he had been privileged to witness. "A lot of them thought he was dead at first." "Oh!" she cried faintly. "Where is he? Have they taken him to the vicarage? Oh, Eric," she added, conscious that he was looking at her curiously. Suddenly he grinned. Having realised her mistake, he decided to delay the dramatic revelation. Like a good wine, it would improve with keeping. "Knocked him clean out, like old Carp. Oh, Marjie, you've missed the Don't, Eric, please." She turned her head aside with a shudder. "They were trying to bring him to with a bucket of water when I left," he added. "Is he much hurt?" In her mind's eye she saw a bruised and bleeding face, out of which gazed a pair of reproachful blue eyes. He had remained to show her he was not afraid. If she had urged him to go away, he would have gone. Perhaps he would have gone if she had not said anything at all. It was all her fault. Of course he couldn't hope to "Old End wanted Postle to run him in." The words seemed to break through the curtain of her thoughts. "You should have seen the vicar," he continued, gloating over the episodes of the afternoon in retrospect. "Rare old sport. He and I kept the ring. If we hadn't he'd have lost. Crowding him like a "Whatever are you talking about?" cried Marjorie, totally at sea as a result of Eric's scare headline form of conversation. "The vicar told Old End that he was the what d'you call it, and " "Who?" "Thirk, of course. You want your brain spring cleaned, Marjie. I'm telling you, and you keep on saying who and what. I'm jolly well going to get him to teach me." "Who? Teach you what?" she stammered. "There you go again. Who? What?" he mimicked. "We're not playing how, when and where. I tell you, it was the biggest thing that ever was. Knocked Carp and Demp into a tea fight. My hat, you should have seen old Thirk go down. Eric, tell There you Marjorie jumped up and gripping his arm shook him impatiently. "Who went down?" she demanded almost fiercely. "Thirk! Let go, you're hurting," he yelled. She released his arm, but continued to stand over him. "He hadn't a chance. Smith got him on the point, and he went down like a sack. It was spiff." Marjorie felt the blood flood to her face, then drain away again. She sank on to the arm of Eric's chair, clutching at the back for support. In a vague way she was conscious that Eric was adding details to what he had already told her. He was filling in the lacunae in his previous story. She seemed able to visualize the village street as if from a height, with its dark crowd of pressing, peering humanity. In the centre two men were gasping, panting, moving. One was dark, his face threatening and blood-stained. The other was fair, a determined light in his blue eyes. She even heard the thud of blows. She saw the dark man stagger. She clutched. "Let go my hair!" In a flash the picture was gone, and she found herself clutching a handful of Eric's fiery coloured hair. "What's the matter with you to day, Marjie?" he demanded as he rubbed his sore scalp. "You off your crump?" Suddenly she put an arm round his neck and drew his head towards her. He wriggled loose and, jumping up from the chair, made for the door, announcing his intention of conveying the good news to Willis and Mrs. Higgs. He had suddenly realised that someone might anticipate him, and it was almost like another fight, hurling these dramatic bombs about and watching them explode. Marjorie did not tell him that she had just sent Willis down to the village for news. 2. The remainder of the afternoon was spent by Little Bilstead in soul searching and mutual recrimination. When Postle had arrived upon the scene, it was to find the biggest crowd he ever remembered to have seen in Little Bilstead. In the centre of it were the vicar and Smith on their knees beside the prostrate form of Bob Thirkettle, bringing him to by chafing his limbs and sponging his face with cold water from a bucket. The sight of Postle seemed to bring to Colonel Enderby a realisation of his responsibilities. He promptly demanded to know the meaning of the policeman's absence at the very hour that Little Bilstead had been most in need of his professional services. Postle tilted his helmet on to the back of his head and proceeded to rub his chin with the pad of his right thumb, as he gazed at the businesslike ministrations of the vicar and Smith upon the inert figure of the redoubtable Thirkettle. "He's copped it up rum 'un," was his thought, his sporting instincts triumphing over his official discretion. It soon became manifest, however, that "the Colonel had his rag out," as Postle was wont to express it to himself, sometimes, in his more expansive moments, even to his intimates. Colonel Enderby let himself go. The curry had digested indifferently well, and he was conscious that he had been shouting encouragements to the vanquished champion. As a result, when Bob Thirkettle at length opened his eyes, it was to find that another battle was being waged over his recumbent form. Colonel Enderby had demanded the arrest of Smith, had threatened to report Postle, and promised Little Bilstead dire penalties for its lapse into Bolshevism, as he regarded this open flouting of his views and opinions. Murmurs of "Give over," "The duzzy fuel," and "Hold your nose," were to be heard on all sides. Colonel Enderby looked about him in astonishment. He was an autocrat getting his first whiff of revolution. That afternoon Little Bilstead made it abundantly clear to him that any man who desired the presence of a policeman to spoil the most enjoyable fight of their lives was worthy neither of his position as an officer nor the respect accorded to a gentleman. At length he fled, or, as he regarded it, withdrew with flags flying and drums beating. He even returned the enemy's fire, but his aim was bad and his ammunition defective, as the frequent laughs at his expense testified. As Mrs. Spelman remarked the next day to Mrs. Pelham, who had missed everything, "It was really most embarrassing. Fortunately I didn't know the meaning of a lot of the words the Colonel used, but I'm sure they were dreadful." When Smith saw that there was no longer any doubt about Thirkettle coming round, he rose and, with a word to Nudd about what to do, linked his arm through that of the vicar and led him in the direction of the vicarage. He was anxious to get a hot bath, conscious that his shoulder was already manifesting an unpleasant tendency to stiffen. It was not until Thirkettle had dropped with a thud in the roadway that he realised that the taller of the two figures that had been so active in keeping the ring was no other than the vicar. He realised that, but for the old man's presence, coupled with his obvious knowledge of the requirements of a quick-footed fighter, it would, in all probability, have been he and not Thirkettle who would have taken the count. Several times the vicar murmured something that to Smith was unintelligible. At length, however, he distinguished that it was a repetition of his unvarying refrain when dissatisfied with his own conduct: "I must really see the bishop." He realised that the old man was passing through the fire of self-reproach for his part in the afternoon's happenings. As they came opposite the gate of the Grange, Willis was standing just inside by the lodge. Smith paused, the vicar continuing his way, as if unconscious that he were not alone. "Did you see him, Mr. Alfred?" Willis asked in a hoarse whisper, looking anxiously about lest some one should overhear. "Did I see whom?" asked Smith, as he lighted his cigarette. "Bob Thirkettle, sir." "I did." "Did he?" paused in his eagerness. "He did, my good Willis, and instead of killing the fatted calf, he strove to slay the prodigal instead." "What did he do, Mr. Alfred? Did he threaten to?" He hesitated. "I'm afraid I loosened most of his teeth, Willis." "You didn't fight him, sir?" His eyes travelled over Smith's face and figure, as if for the signs of defeat he felt must be there. "I'm afraid I did," said Smith with a smile. "And you beat him, sir?" That, I think, was the general impression." He was amused at the old man's eagerness. "You beat Bob Thirkettle, Mr. Alfred." There was incredulity in his tone. "When I left him he was lying on his back, just coming to and trying to puzzle out how it had all happened." "Mr. Alfred, Mr. Alfred," was all Willis could say. "When I heard you'd gone, I thought he would kill you." "And were you coming to save me, Willis?" "I was just going down to the village, sir," he said simply. "I couldn't stay in the house." Willis was a bad liar, but he realised that he could not say that Miss Marjorie had sent him. "Well, I'm all right, you see," Smith smiled. "Now I must try and catch up with the vicar," and he passed on up the road, leaving Willis gazing after him, a look in his eyes that plainly spoke the hero worship in his heart. As he entered the vicarage he heard the vicar saying: "But, Hannah, I have a distinct recollection of feeling satisfaction when he was knocked out. I even think I said 'Splendid.' I must see the bishop, Hannah. I fear I am not worthy to be the shepherd of a flock." "Well?" she demanded, as Smith approached, the vicar seizing the opportunity to escape to his study. "What is this I hear?" There was something almost like a twinkle in her eyes, he thought. "I have been carrying the sweetening process to its logical conclusion," he replied gravely. "At least, I hope it's the conclusion." "I hope you realise that you have involved the vicar in a parish scandal. I understand he acted as a sort of master of the ceremonies." She had heard the story from Janet, who learned everything almost as soon as it happened, for Janet was comely, possessed of many admirers, and loved scandal. Without waiting for a reply, Miss Lipscombe turned and led the way into the drawing room, where she seated herself in the most upright chair it contained, folded her hands before her, and waited. In a few words Smith outlined what had taken place, and how he had been involved in the fight in spite of himself. "And that is what you call sweetening a man's memory, is it?" she demanded, when he had finished. "It was part of the process," he admitted. "Your methods savour of the Mohammedan," was the retort. "May I enquire what is the next step you propose?" she enquired dryly. "To pursue the analogy," he said, "my Hegira. I'm leaving Little Bilstead in a day or two." "Leaving?" There was surprise in her tone. "Yes." "Why?" "The sweetening process is almost concluded." "Fiddlesticks!" she cried. "Just because you've thrashed a bully, you think " She paused. "What will Lady Warren say when she returns?" "I hope to be able to give her news of her son." Miss Lipscombe's rigid figure seemed to become even more rigid. She continued to regard him, keen enquiry in her eyes. "I believe Alfred Warren to be dead, and " he paused. "And?" She stopped suddenly, her hand raised to her heart. "I think I shall be able to prove it," he added quietly, "but I would rather say nothing more at present." For some time neither spoke. It was Smith who finally broke the silence. "We only know the Alfred Warren of up to 1914," he said, as if to himself. "Perhaps " He left the sentence unfinished. "I have often wondered," she said, an unusual note of softness in her voice. "I was fond of him, Mr. Smith," she added a little huskily. "You see, I was his godmother." "Is that why you wanted to see his memory sweetened?" he enquired. "Perhaps it was," she admitted. "I'm a selfish old woman. But it's done you no harm?" Her tone was that of enquiry rather than assertion. He shook his head. It was difficult to express exactly what Alfred Warren had done for him. He now seemed to see quite a lot of things in detail that hitherto had been either outlines or mere blurs. He could no longer contemplate a life such as he had led before the war. There must be action, progression. He must "He was to have married Marjorie." The words seemed to scatter his thoughts like a dog a lot of hens. "He? Who?" he asked vaguely, although conscious of who it was she meant. "Alfred," she said. "At least, that was Lady Warren's wish." "And Marjorie?" He could not restrain the question. "She was too young at the time to know. was the reply. "Perhaps she was being reserved for someone else," she added. "And now go and get changed out of your fighting clothes. There are soda scones for tea." As he walked slowly upstairs, it was of Marjorie he was thinking, not of Miss Lipscombe's soda scones, although they had been made specially for him as his favourite tea table dainty. "Married to Marjorie," he muttered as he closed his door. Perhaps that was why. Chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Return of Alfred by Herbert George Jenkins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 22. The Unmasking of Smith. "He shall hear what I have to say," exploded Sir John Hildreth angrily. Then, without waiting for a reply, he continued: "Here am I, dashing all over the country, inserting advertisements, thinking of notifying the police even, whilst that infernal young—" "The police must have been a recent idea, John," put in Mrs. Compton Stacey quietly. "This is the first I've heard of it." "Don't interrupt me, Charlotte," he cried, picking up the thread of his discourse. "I've every reason to be annoyed, being led this wild goose chase about the country, when I might have been He paused, blinking uncertainly. It was annoying not to be able to think of anything else he might have been doing. "There was nothing you could have been doing, John," said Mrs. Compton Stacey placidly, "except reading trashy novels, or bullying poor—" "They're not trashy, and I don't bully," he retorted lamely. I expostulate occasionally. If it hadn't been for the idea I got out of a novel, we shouldn't have found Darrell," he added with inspiration. "And if you hadn't bullied him because his taste in women was not your own, we should not have lost him," she replied calmly. "Besides, we haven't found him yet," she added. There was silence for several minutes. Sir John was grappling with his sister's logic. "What should we do without the robin?" she said presently, as a burst of song broke through the monotonous hum of the car. "Damn the robin!" he exploded. He disliked irrelevancies. "When you get in this mood, John, you condemn everybody and everything except the one person you would like to condemn most, myself," she remarked presently, turning to get a better view of his frowning face. "Don't talk a lot of confounded nonsense," he snapped, but the tint of his neck belied the irascibility of his words. With Sir John, anger always flew to his neck. Mrs. Compton Stacey could read the signs with ease. Puce meant ungovernable fury. The ghost of a smile fluttered about the corners of her mouth, and her hand fell lightly upon his. No one else had ever discovered the secret of how to handle John Hildreth. "Don't be a fool, Charlotte," he cried, but he did not withdraw his hand. These occasional touches of sentiment meant more to him than he would allow, even to himself. "It's all your fault." "What is my fault?" she enquired calmly. "You've always spoiled him, ever since he was a baby." But the tone in which the accusation was made seemed to lack conviction. Mrs. Compton Stacey smiled behind her motoring veil. The few really serious disagreements they had ever had were the outcome of her having been, as her brother expressed it, too hard on the boy. The next mile was covered in silence, Sir John being occupied in going feverishly through his pockets with the air of a man who has lost something of value. "What are you looking for, John?" she enquired at length. "That infernal letter," he muttered. "I know I brought it with me." "You gave it to me to mind," she said, opening her handbag and producing an envelope. "Then why couldn't you say so?" he cried, "instead of letting me search every pocket I've got half a dozen times over?" Snatching the envelope from her, he tore out the contents, a single sheet of cheap note paper, with a grease spot in the right hand bottom corner, and for the 20th time that day he read: "Dear Sirs, I am the postman at Little Bilstead, and seeing your advert for James Smith I hasten to apply. He is here and being watched. Come at once and bring money with you. Ask for Mr. Bassingthwaighte at the post office, and tell no one, it is serious, and we have a policeman here, your respectful servant, T. Bassingthwaighte." "Confound the fellow," was his comment, as he folded the letter and replaced it in the envelope, which he handed to his sister. But whether it was the postman or his own nephew he desired confounded was not clear. "Bassingthwaighte," he muttered. Absurd name. That morning he was prepared to disagree with everybody and criticise everything. It was characteristic of Sir John Hildreth that, when anxious, or if sentiment showed any tendency to obtrude itself, he invariably manifested irritation. He would give a beggar half a crown and tell him to go to the devil, whereas another man would make it twopence and a suggestion that he should get work. His ideal of an Englishman was even more austere than that of the public schoolboy. No display of emotion, a soft emotion that is, was permissible, even in thought. He was a Spartan, destitute of the cloak of philosophy. That morning, as Mrs. Compton Stacey was having breakfast on the lawn, she had been interrupted by the sound of a car being driven furiously up the drive, its klaxon horn in continuous action. She had recognised both the horn and her brother's impetuosity behind. If ever he were excited and came over to seek her advice, he invariably arrived with the klaxon horn in full blast, so that she might be ready to receive him. But never had she known anything quite so violent. Rising from her meal, she had gone to the edge of the lawn bordering the drive. A moment later the car came into view, and amidst sparking tires, Chivers, the chauffeur, had brought it to a standstill opposite her, a sheepish look upon his good-humoured face. He always looked sheepish when arriving with the band, as he called it in the servants' hall, that is, when Sir John told him to keep up a continuous blast upon the horn. "I've found him!" Sir John had shouted at the sight of his sister. Then he had bounced out of the car, shouting to Chivers to tune it up for a long run. He had displayed the letter from the Little Bilstead postman with the air of one who has reason to feel pleased with himself. He informed her that he was motoring over to Norfolk at once, and that she was going with him. Having nothing else particularly to occupy her, she had consented, and within half an hour they were humming along due east, a look of quiet content upon Chivers' face. He had been told to "let her out and damn the fines," and that, to Sir John Hildreth's chauffeur, meant bliss, although to the roadside fauna it meant syncope or death, sometimes both. With characteristic impulsiveness, Sir John had forgotten that even the best of cars can scarcely go from Wiltshire to Norfolk and back in a day, and he had made no provision for the night. Chivers, however, in collusion with Sir John's man, had corrected the omission. At that moment there reposed on the seat beside the chauffeur a suit-case with all the necessary equipment by which a gentleman can go to sleep at night and perform his toilet in the morning. In spite of his explosive nature, Sir John Hildreth was worshipped by his servants. He was just, generous, and so-called white, and although he damned them all with the utmost impartiality, they knew that their troubles, when they came, would be his troubles, and his purse theirs. It was nearly 4 o'clock when Chivers put his foot to the brake at the top of the hill that dipped into Little Bilstead. As they approached, Sir John began to bob about excitedly in his seat. Repose of manner was as foreign to his nature as the manifestation of sentiment. "Something the matter," he murmured at the sight of the knots of people with which the roadway was dotted. "Perhaps it's a populous district," suggested Mrs. Compton Stacey dryly. He grunted something unintelligible as Chivers slowed down. "Where's the post office?" he inquired of a tall, ramrod-like figure of a man to whom Chivers had taken an instinctive dislike, and was endeavouring to force into the hedge. It was Colonel Enderby trying to work off the combined effects of undigested curry and sudden unpopularity. "Be damned to you!" he shouted, meaning Chivers. "Be damned to you too!" yelled Sir John over the back of the car, not to be outdone in the amenities of the road. "Here, slow up, Chivers," he called as they approached a group in the road. "Where's the post office?" he demanded again. Several proceeded to answer the question in unison. Even had they replied separately, it is doubtful if Sir John would have been any the wiser, the Norfolk dialect being a bar to intimate communion with strangers. The sudden grind of brakes, however, together with Chivers' dexter forefinger, which performed an arc from the steering wheel to a spot on the right-hand side of the road and then to his cap, showed that he had discovered the post office for himself. At the sight of the car stopping outside his establishment, Tom Bassingthwaighte's heart gave a great bound. With a shout of "Wanted more" to his sister, he left old Mrs. Moggridge, who always bought a stamp as if it were a triangular cape, about the genuineness of which she were doubtful, and darted round the little corner, upset a pile of firewood tied in bundles, jumped a box containing a hearthstone, and was beside the car a moment later. "Are you Meister Truelove?" he stammered hoarsely. "You Bassingthwaighte?" barked Sir John, equally excited. The postman nodded. Words seemed to refuse to come at his brain's bidding. "Jump in, then," cried Sir John. "No, beside the chauffeur," he added hastily, as Tom Bassingthwaighte's trembling hand fumbled with the handle of the door. In a flash he had dodged round the bonnet and was beside Chivers, almost before the chauffeur had time to remove the suit case from the seat to the floor. "Straight on," almost sobbed Bassingthwaighte, who seemed instinctively to realise what was required of him. "I'll show you, bor." And before anyone had properly realised what was happening, Little Bilstead saw its postman whisked away in a high powered touring car, apparently with the postman's full acquiescence. "Well, I'll be danged," muttered Tom Simmons, "if that ain't the rum 'un." Once clear of the village, Mrs. Compton Stacey signalled to Chivers to stop. "What the devil are you doing?" demanded Sir John excitedly. "I want to know why all those people were about, for one thing," she replied calmly, "and for another, it is as well that we should know what has happened. Is anything the matter?" she enquired of Bassingthwaighte. From the broad Norfolk of the postman, after he had been urged by Sir John not to go "so damn quick," Mrs. Compton Stacey and her brother pieced together sufficient to acquaint them with the fact that there had been a fight, and that Mist' Alfred had come off victor. Furthermore, they gathered that Mist' Alfred appeared to be a sort of trinity, the other component parts being James Smith and their errant nephew, and that there had been rare goings on together. "And you'll give me the £25?" Tom Bassingthwaighte had enquired eagerly in conclusion. "Of course," was Sir John's curt answer. "If you conduct us to the Mr. James Smith we want," added his sister, whereat the little postman flopped down upon the seat again, as the car jerked forward to the realisation of what he hoped would be fortune. The car turned into the drive leading up to the vicarage, and the vicar himself was seen walking from them, his hands clasped behind his back, apparently deep in thought. As the car slid up beside him, he started violently, as if suddenly snatched back to life from another world. "The gentleman be looking for Mist' Alfred, sir," called out Tom Bassingthwaighte, almost apoplectic with excitement now that the reward seemed within his grasp. "Smith, you fool, not Alfred," burst out Sir John. "That's all right," began the postman. "Ouch!" he broke off with a yelp, as Chivers dug him in the ribs with a vigorous elbow. By this time the vicar, hat in hand, had approached Mrs. Compton Stacey's side of the car. "We are looking for Mr. James Smith," she said in her quiet level tones, "and " "This fellow says he's staying with you," broke in Sir John, unable to tolerate a walking on part. "I advertised for him. He's my nephew, Darrell Hildreth. Confounded young puppy!" Sir John was off like a back-firing motor lorry. The vicar gazed at him in bewilderment, then at Mrs. Compton Stacey, and back again to Sir John. "Smith?" he murmured, as if exploring the inner recesses of his memory. "James Smith. I seem to remember the name. Ah, yes. A wonderful left." Sir John gazed at the vicar with the air of a man who, although he sympathises with the insane, dislikes intensely to encounter them. "Is he here?" enquired Mrs. Compton Stacey gently. "You must have tea," said the vicar, as if he had not heard the query. "Hannah would wish it. I don't think we've had tea yet." He paused thoughtfully. "It was to be soda scones, I believe. Or was that yesterday? I am very absent minded," he said, turning to Mrs. Compton Stacey with a wraith of a smile that had the effect of dissipating even the explosive gases that had been accumulating in Sir John. "If the soda scones were for to-day, then I'm sure we haven't had tea yet. I couldn't have forgotten Hannah's soda scones so soon." Having thus expressed himself as if the interrogation had been exclusively concerned with tea and soda scones, the vicar turned and, his hands behind him clasping his hat, he proceeded to walk up the drive in the direction of the vicarage. Apparently he had forgotten all about the car and its occupants. Blowing out his cheeks, Sir John glared after the retreating black-coated figure. There was something about the scholarly dignity of the old man that seemed to forbid calling after him. "What the devil are we to do now, Charlotte?" he cried irritably. "Go and see if there really are soda scones for tea," was the placid rejoinder, as Chivers, always the man for a crisis, started the car. "There he is!" cried Sir John suddenly, as they came within sight of the vicarage. Smith, who was in the act of raising a soda scone to his mouth, seemed suddenly to become petrified, the scone poised in mid air, his mouth slightly parted to receive it. "Great Gulliver!" he cried. "My uncle!" "You young scamp!" roared Sir John, as he fumbled feverishly with the door of the car. "What's the meaning of—" He stopped as if shot. He had just caught sight of Miss Lipscombe as she rose into prominence from a low chair on the further side of the table. Covering the few yards to the car in half a dozen strides, Smith had Sir John's hand firmly gripped in his own. There was a genuine light of gladness in his eyes as he gazed upon the apoplectic features of his relative. "This is splendid of you, sir, and you too, Aunt Charlotte," he cried, looking into the smiling eyes of his aunt. "You," began Sir John, but his voice seemed suddenly to have become husky, and with his disengaged hand he tugged a handkerchief from his pocket. The vicar stood watching the scene, a vague, bemused look in his eyes, whilst Tom Bassingthwaighte, a silly grin upon his face, stood up in the car, a sort of self constituted master of the ceremonies. "Here he be, you see. Didn't I tell you?" he cried. "There's £25." Ouch! Once more the sphinx like Chivers had intervened, this time by bringing down his foot upon the postman's corn infested toes, as if they had been a brake pedal and danger threatened. Slowly, and in little exclamatory sentences, like bursts from a machine gun, a great dramatic moment was smoothed into a pleasant social gathering. Mrs. Compton Stacey and Sir John alighted from the car, which Chivers started in the direction of the stables, holding the excited postman to the seat with his disengaged hand. Mrs. Compton Stacey and Miss Lipscombe between them gradually got the situation in hand. Sir John was sprayed with soothing small talk, the vicar was given a soda scone, and Smith gazed from his aunt to his uncle and back again in a way that told Miss Lipscombe that all was well, or at least would be. Only once was there an echo of the drama that had so recently threatened to shatter the peace of the vicarage lawn, a yell from the direction of the stables. It was Chivers indicating to the mercenary Bassingthwaighte that enough for the day is the evil thereof, and that a Hildreth paid at his own time in his own way. That afternoon the Little Bilstead mail bags carried to Messrs. Truelove and Murchison 9 communications, each telling that the writers knew sufficient about the whereabouts of one James Smith to ensure the earning of the £25 reward offered. Chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Return of Alfred by Herbert George Jenkins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 23. Mr. Gadgett Tells the Truth. 1. "It was absolutely spiff, sir," cried Eric ecstatically. "He simply hit Marsh all over the field." He was describing to Sir John for the third time how his nephew had won for Little Bilstead the annual cricket match against Upper Saxton. Sir John had slept well, Janet's coffee had been devilishly good, as he had told Smith, and he was feeling intensely eupeptic. Immediately after breakfast Eric had arrived across the Birds' breakfast table, and he had arrived unrebuked. His frank hero worship of Smith (he persisted in the name), coupled with the fact that he appeared to find nothing in Sir John of which to be afraid, had rendered them friends from the kick off, as Eric later expressed it to Marjorie. To appear afraid of Sir John was to ensure his dislike. "Then," continued Eric, switching on to the previous day's encounter, "you should have seen old Thirk go." He stopped suddenly. A moment later there was a flash of orange, and Eric had disappeared behind a holly bush into which Smith had threatened to throw Mr. Bluggs. Sir John looked about him in bewilderment, searching for something to account for the inexplicable disappearance of his companion. Suddenly his gaze became fixed, the veins in his forehead began to swell, and the tint of his complexion deepened to puce. Coming up the vicarage drive was a policeman, accompanied by a portly man in a brown and white check suit. At the sight of the luxuriant auburn moustache adorning the newcomer's upper lip, Sir John's eyes seemed in danger of starting from their sockets. He blew out his cheeks angrily. What the devil is the meaning of this, Peters?" he exploded. "I'm taking a holiday, Sir John," was the self-possessed reply as Peters removed his cap. "I didn't expect to see you, sir." "Taking a holiday!" gasped Sir John. "Didn't expect to see me! Are you with Mr. Darrell?" he demanded, a sudden thought striking him. "No, sir, I am alone." "Alone?" He turned his fierce gaze upon Postle, who had tipped his helmet on to the back of his head and was meditatively rubbing a bristly chin with the pad of his right thumb. "And what the deuce do you want?" he demanded. "This gentleman say he have been assaulted while in a stooping position," came the sing-song reply, "and I fare to think that I—" He paused, quelled by the irate baronet's eye. "What the devil does all this mean?" he demanded of Peters. "I think, sir, that there has perhaps been a little mistake," said Peters suavely. "Some days back I was—" "Assaulted when in a stooping position," broke in Postle. "I was not then aware that a young gentleman with the catapult was a friend of Mr. Darrell's. The policeman has just told me." Sir John looked from one to the other, his tongue unable to keep pace with the tint of his neck. "Look here, Peters," he cried with sudden inspiration, "if it hadn't been for your tomfoolery about growing hair on your face, all this wouldn't have happened. I don't wonder the boy shot at you. Who wouldn't?" he added. "I'm sorry, Sir John," began Peters with dignity when, like a tornado, his late master was down upon him. "Don't be sorry," he snorted. "Get shaved. Remove that disgusting mess from your upper lip." "When I found that you objected to my hirsute—" "Objected to your what?" "My moustache, Sir John. I resigned," said Peters with dignity. "And what is the result? Mr. Darrell lost, me running wild goose chases all over the country, Mr. Darrell nearly killed by some low ruffian." "I understand, Sir John," said Peters, reassuming his cap and endeavouring to adjust it to what he conceived to be the correct angle, "that it was the ruffian who was hurt." Sir John opened his mouth to retort, and then, as if thinking better of it, turned suddenly upon Postle, who had been listening intently, with his mouth. "What the devil are you waiting for?" he demanded. "This gentleman say he have been assaulted. He say—" "He's not a gentleman. He's my butler," was the retort, "and be damned to you," he added. Postle turned to Peters. Drama was none too common in Little Bilstead, and he wanted to see this one out. "You—" he began, when Peters interrupted him with a lordly wave of his hand, with which he was accustomed to dismiss hawkers and other itinerants. "I've already told you that the charge is withdrawn," he said. "Constable," he added, as a sop to the Cerberus of Postle's vanity. Realising that as far as he was concerned the drama was ended, Postle turned on a reluctant heel, casting a longing look over his shoulder as he reached the point when another step would blot out what he had hoped would be the most dramatic scene of his career. As Postle's heavy-footed form disappeared from view, Eric's red head reappeared round the corner of the harness room. "I say, I'm sorry if I hurt you," he said to Peters, still keeping at what he regarded as a tactful distance. "You know, sir," he added, turning to Sir John, "I pinged this gentleman." "Gentleman!" repeated Sir John irritably. "He's my butler." "I was your butler, Sir John," said Peters, "until I—" "Turned yourself into a caricature," cried Sir John, "after 15 years of service," he added with self-pity. "I think it's topping," said Eric, restraining a grin with difficulty as he gazed at Peters' auburn wonder with great intentness. "Puts me in mind of old Kitch," he added. "There!" cried Sir John. "You see?" and there was triumph in his voice. "I think, Sir John, with your permission, I will withdraw," said Peters with great dignity. "Withdraw and be damned!" Sir John finished the sentence with a cough. He had suddenly realised Eric's youth. "Very good, sir," said Peters, bowing with the imperturbability of the well-trained servant, and, turning, he walked away with the stiffness of deportment he usually assumed when announcing "A person to see you, Sir John." "Where's that young scamp?" demanded Sir John. "And the others?" he added, the tint of his neck rapidly approaching normal. In the pair of grey green eyes Eric turned upon him there was mystery, the hush of the villain of melodrama. "He's gone to see Marjie, I think," he announced mysteriously. "Marjie?" cried Sir John. "Who's he?" "She's my sister, sir," said Eric, a look on his face that seemed to require only a surplice. "You know, we saw her just now when we came back from the church. On her horse, sir," he added anxiously. He did not want that there should be any mistake, as they had also encountered Miss Marshall. "She's frightfully in other ways too," announced Eric. "Frightfully what?" "Decent, sir," said Eric, with a self-conscious grin. "I'm sorry." He paused. Sir John had blown through his lips, as if "dece" had been a piece of thistledown to be sent to the four winds of heaven. "Of course it's frightfully sudden, I mean," Eric added quickly, as he saw Sir John's lips forming an enquiry. "But I saw it from the first." "Saw what from the first?" Sir John stopped dead, as if he felt he had a better chance of understanding Eric's mysterious talk if in a stationary position. "That they were in love, and all that silly rot." He paused for the fraction of a second; but remembering that his cricket was at stake, he added, "and would marry." Then he held his breath and waited. "Marry!" Eric had not underestimated the power of the explosion. For a moment Sir John seemed in danger of apoplexy. He blinked like a cinematograph film, glanced about him in a dazed sort of manner, blew out his cheeks, and finally fixed his eyes on Eric. "But he doesn't want to marry," he cried. "That's why he " He stopped suddenly, realising that Eric was but a child. "Well, he's all over Marjie," was the rejoinder. Eric had decided that it was no time for half measures. "Everybody wants to marry Marjie," he added, with the inspiration of the house agent who assures a client that a number of people are after these desirable premises. Sir John recalled the vision of a girl careering over the countryside on "a splendid animal," as he had remarked at the time. If there was one thing more than another he loved, it was a good piece of horseflesh. The only complaint he had against Vera Truscombe was that she rode a horse as if it were a damned bicycle. Eric's announcement had sobered him considerably. The insubordination of Peters in growing a moustache, the fact that his man had packed him only 2 collars, and the memory of Tom Bassingthwaighte having dunned him before breakfast for the £25, all were absorbed in this startling piece of information. If he interfered further in his nephew's matrimonial affairs, he would in all probability disappear again, the headstrong young puppy, and Sir John had missed him more than he cared to admit, even to himself. "The confounded sly young puppy," he muttered under his breath. "He said it was the railway strike." But there was no anger in his tone. Eric expanded his lungs to their normal extent. Another obstacle to his mastery of fast bowling had been removed. 2. After breakfast that morning, Smith had gone down to the village to enquire after Thirkettle, and, if possible, to see him. From John Nudd, however, he learned that his late antagonist had left Little Bilstead the previous night. Before doing so, however, he seemed to have expressed himself with some heat upon the subject of the trick that had been played him. He appeared to regard the whole affair as a "put-up job," and that the services of a prize fighter, bearing a strong resemblance to Alfred Warren, had been secured. "But I won't forget it together," he had assured them malevolently. He had threatened to set about the whole village, hinted at wrecking the public bar of the Pigeons, had even gone to the extent of telling Postle that he wasn't going to stand any of his squid, whereat Postle had withdrawn to his cottage, and was seen later with his boots in a high state of polish. Such of the men of Little Bilstead as Smith encountered that morning showed a marked change in their demeanour, particularly those who, like Jack Bean, had been loudest in their denunciations of Mist' Alfred. They realised that a man who could give Bob Thirkettle "cosh" was one to be treated with respect. The women seemed to have gone over to him to a petticoat, judging from the nods and smiles he encountered, whilst the children gazed up at him in awe and large eyed wonder. Social Little Bilstead also was moving, as Smith escaped Colonel Enderby by 10 seconds. and Mrs. Spelman by barely 15. The object of the one was to tender apologies, as he afterwards expressed it to Miss Jell, and of the other to invite the only lion Little Bilstead had ever known to take tea with her that afternoon. Unaware of his providential escape, Smith strolled back to the vicarage, his thoughts busy with the happenings of the past 24 hours. What was Marjorie doing? What was she thinking? He was determined to see her again. When Sir John had enquired of him the previous evening what were his plans, he had avoided giving a definite answer. He had no plans until he knew. Knew what? As he turned into the vicarage drive, he became conscious of a little group standing just within the gate. "Ah, here he is!" he heard from beneath Miss Lipscombe's faded blue sunbonnet. With her were his aunt and Peters. "This seems to be a place of happy rencontres," smiled Mrs. Compton Stacey, as he joined them. She was glad to see Peters again. She had missed him almost as much as her brother had. "Good morning, sir," said Peters, removing his cap once more. He disliked removing his cap when there was no looking glass handy, and that was the third time he had been called upon to do it that morning. He had discovered that the effectiveness of a cap was in direct ratio to the angle at which it is worn. "Well, what's the news?" enquired Smith. Peters hesitated. "I got Peters to make some enquiries about Alfred Warren," he explained to Miss Lipscombe. "You remember a man named Gadgett calling?" She nodded, and turned to Peters, an eager look in her eyes. "Mr. Warren was killed at Neuve Chapelle," said Peters. With a quick indrawing of breath, Miss Lipscombe's hand went up to her left side. In swift understanding, Mrs. Compton Stacey linked her arm through that of the older woman. "Go on," said Miss Lipscombe almost fiercely. "I'm not going to faint, although I am a fool." "Tell us what happened, Peters," said Smith, his eyes upon Miss Lipscombe's face, which had gone very white. "I saw Mr. Gadgett, sir," Peters continued, "as you instructed, and he told me that Mr. Warren enlisted in August 1914, under the name of Smith." "Smith?" "Yes, sir. James Smith." "Great Gulliver!" murmured Smith under his breath. "What a strange coincidence," murmured Mrs. Compton Stacey, who was clasping Miss Lipscombe's right hand in both her own. "He was defending a wounded officer, and " With a choking sob Miss Lipscombe turned and leaning heavily on Mrs. Compton Stacey's arm, walked slowly up the drive. "Go on, Peters," said Smith, his eyes following the retreating figures of the two women; and Peters proceeded to tell how, by what he referred to as diplomacy, he had extracted from Mr. Gadgett the news of Alfred Warren's death, and a promise to furnish Lady Warren's solicitors with all the information he possessed. "But how did you manage it?" cried Smith, puzzled at what appeared to be the entire capitulation of the crafty Mr. Gadgett. Peters hesitated, but only for the fraction of a second. "I'm afraid I had to depend on diplomacy, sir." "Not violence?" "No, sir," and there was regret in Peters' voice. "There were clerks in the outer office, and Mr. Gadgett was near the bell." "And what form did your diplomacy take?" "I happened to mention, sir, that there was to be a dinner of the non commissioned officers of the battalion next week, and that his address " He paused. "Peters," said Smith gravely, "do you realise that was pure Prussianism, the very thing we fought against?" "It was the only way, sir." Having arranged with Peters to send up to the vicarage the clothes he had brought, and remain on at The Pigeons until he received further orders, Smith dismissed him. As he entered the vicarage, Miss Lipscombe came to the door of the drawing room and beckoned to him. There was a strange softness in her eyes as he closed the door and turned to her. "Mr. Hildreth," she said huskily, as she extended a none too steady hand to him, "I want to thank you for what you have done." He took the hand extended to him. He could not trust his voice. "I think," she continued a moment later, I think I see the hand of God in this." And there were tears in her eyes. "He made good," was all Smith could think of to say. Chapter 24 of The Return of Alfred by Herbert George Jenkins. Recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24. Eric pronounces it Spiff. "Well, Willis, you see you were wrong and I was right." Willis had just thrown open the hall door of The Grange with that smile he seemed to keep specially for Smith. "Yes, sir," said Willis, as he stood aside to allow Smith to enter. "It's all very wonderful, sir. You'll be going away now, I suppose, Mr. Sir," he corrected himself. Smith noted the mournful inflection of his voice. "Yes, Willis, I'm sorry to say. Is Miss Marjorie in?" "Yes, sir," and the old man's voice was noticeably husky. "She's in the morning room, sir." "I shall always regard you as my good Samaritan," said Smith, smiling in spite of himself at the recollection of their first meeting. "Thank you, sir," said Willis, fumbling at the tails of his coat, a moment later producing a large coloured handkerchief, with which he proceeded to blow his nose and surreptitiously mop his eyes. "It'll be like losing Mr. Alfred all over again, sir," he mumbled through the folds of the handkerchief. And he trailed off into something between a sniff and a sob. "Cheer up, Willis," said Smith, touched by the old man's obvious regret that he was going. "It's not so bad as all that." "It's terrible for us, sir," was the melancholy response as he continued to mop his eyes. "Mrs. Higgs has had 2 goes of hysterics, and I'm sure she'll have another before the day's out." "I'm dreadfully sorry," said Smith, conscious of the feebleness of the remark. "Then there's Mrs. Death, sir," Willis continued, as if determined to squeeze every drop of misery from the catastrophe. "She had visions last night, sir, and she says she feels another coming on. And she can't cook when she has visions, sir, and " he broke off huskily. "I'm afraid my coming has upset everybody." "It isn't your coming, sir. It's your going. It " Again his voice failed him. Deeply touched though he was by the old man's grief, Smith found himself at a loss how to comfort him. If you were only coming back again, sir, if just for an hour, it would be something to look forward to. I'm sure Mrs. Death will be ill if she has another vision, sir. She says it reminds her of when her baby had pneumonia. It's terrible, sir." The tears were now streaming down his cheeks, without any attempt on his part to arrest their flow. "Now, Willis, you mustn't give way," said Smith soothingly, as if speaking to a child. "Perhaps Mr. Alfred will come back and " "He won't, sir," sobbed Willis. "I seem to know now that he's dead, and if he did, Bob Thirkettle would kill him. He isn't as strong as you are, sir." "What makes you think Mr. Alfred is dead?" enquired Smith curiously. "We feel it, sir, me and Mrs. Death, sir," he quavered. "And I don't know who's to prepare Miss Marjorie's luncheon. We can't give her sardines again. She had them for breakfast." Smith turned aside to hide a smile. "Now, Willis, cheer up, and tell Mrs. Higgs that I will come back soon, just to see my good friends at The Grange, and we'll have tea in her pretty little sitting room and " "You will, sir? You mean it?" cried Willis, sunlight shining through his tears. In his eagerness he had clutched Smith by the coat sleeve. "I promise," said Smith gravely, more touched by the old man's gratitude than he cared to confess, even to himself. "Now I'll go and find Miss Marjorie. No, don't come," he added, as Willis made a movement to lead the way to the morning room. "You go and tell Mrs. Higgs and Mrs. Death. I hope it won't give Mrs. Higgs hysterics again," he murmured, shaking his head dubiously. "She has them very easy, sir." Leaving Willis to his lugubrious forebodings, Smith crossed the hall to the morning room. Opening the door softly, he entered. "May I come in?" he enquired. Marjorie, who was standing looking out from the French windows, turned with a start. She felt herself flushing, for at that very moment she was wondering if he had already left Little Bilstead, or if he would go without calling. From Eric she had received a full, true and particular account of the dramatic arrival of Sir John Hildreth and his sister, with old Bess. "I've come to say good bye," continued Smith. "Mr. Hildreth," she said gravely, as she extended her hand, "how does one apologise when one is almost too humiliated to think of " "One doesn't," he smiled. "Please don't be magnanimous," she begged, as she dropped into a chair, motioning him to another. "I thought I shouldn't have the courage to meet you again," she said. "And you have?" "Yes, but " She paused. "I gave you no option," he suggested. "I could scarcely run away, could I?" she interrogated. "You might have tried," he suggested with a smile, "although I warn you I should have given chase." "Please don't," she said, gazing at the point of a dainty bronze shoe with the air of one who finds it difficult to explain. "I'm very much ashamed of myself. I ought to have known." "Why?" "Oh, there were a lot of things." Her voice was now quite friendly, he decided. It seemed to have lost that quality of well bred indifference that had always so piqued him in the past. "You must think me a horrible prig." She looked up suddenly and gazed straight into his eyes. "Shall we agree to let bygones be bygones," he suggested, "and begin afresh?" She shook her head with a slow but decided air. "That's impossible, I'm afraid," she said. "Why impossible?" "When I was quite a tiny thing," there was the ghost of a smile as her eyes remained fixed upon her shoe tip, "I remember if ever I had been naughty I would never allow myself to be forgiven until I had done " She paused. "Penance?" he suggested. She nodded. "Well, why not do penance now?" he suggested eagerly. Again she shook her head, with the same air of decision. "It had to be something that satisfied me, something I hated doing and which hurt." "But surely, if I say it doesn't matter," he began, when she interrupted him. "That wouldn't make any difference," she insisted. "I suppose it's conscience, and I require absolution." "But I give it, full measure and brimming over," he said quickly. "Surely that ends it." "None but a priest can grant absolution," she said gravely. Her eyes reproached him. "Let's send for one," he smiled. "I know I must seem ridiculous," she said, a slight flush colouring her cheeks, which seemed to him unusually pale, "but I can't explain." "Will you answer me one question, quite frankly and honestly?" he asked, watching her delicately tapered fingers as they trifled with a jade ornament hung by a black ribbon from her neck. She hesitated for a moment, then looked straight into his eyes. "Yes, I will." "If it hadn't been for what you thought, do you think we should have been friends?" He was conscious that his heart was pumping with a quite unnecessary amount of vigour. "Yes, I think we should." Her eyes fell again, and her flush deepened. "Nero liked you, and Eric," she continued with an obvious effort, "and I always like the people they like." "After all, you had to go upon the evidence you possessed," he suggested, "and everybody recognised me as Alfred Warren." "But I should have known." There was in her tone the persistence of a child who refuses to be comforted. There was a prolonged silence. Smith was cudgelling his brains for something that would help her to modify the harsh judgment into which she had entered against herself. "I think I owe you an explanation also," he said at length, noting her distress. "I think it is I who am really to blame. If I hadn't descended upon you all in the way I did, there would have been no misunderstanding." She shook her head for the third time. "It all came about in a very curious way," he continued. "My uncle, who was a splendid old fellow but a bit volcanic, and I, had a difference of opinion about the subject of noses." He noticed the suggestion of a furrow between her brows, as she continued to gaze at the point of her shoe. He had selected a wife for me, and somehow we didn't seem to see quite eye to eye. Or perhaps I should say nez à nez. You see, it crinkled when she laughed." She looked up suddenly, a startled expression in her eyes, then, at the quizzical expression on his face, she smiled involuntarily. "My uncle and I had an argument which developed into something more serious. He practically ordered me to marry her. I expostulated that I could never live down those crinkles. I'm afraid I behaved rather badly by treating the whole matter with unnecessary flippancy. You see, her estates bordered on ours, and my uncle was anxious to link them together." He paused for a second, but at a little nod from her he continued. "The upshot of it was that he cut me off with a shilling, and told me to go to the devil, so " "You came to Little Bilstead?" she interrupted demurely, without raising her eyes. At that moment he decided she was prettier than he had ever remembered to have seen her. "Perhaps it would be more accurate to say that fate and the railway strike landed me here," he continued, "and " "But was it necessary to change your name?" she queried, leaning forward slightly. "My uncle rather rubbed it in about going to the dogs, and dragging the family name with me, and I'm afraid I must have got a little short tempered. I told him that I would never use the name of Hildreth again until I had his permission, and the next morning in the bath I christened myself James Smith. You see, I enlisted under that name. Private Darrell Hildreth didn't seem to sound quite right somehow, and I wanted to stay in the ranks. And that's all there is to tell," he concluded. For nearly a minute there was silence. Her gaze was concentrated upon the point of her shoe. "I came to say good bye," he said, finding the silence embarrassing. She continued to play with the jade ornament she had worn the first time he saw her. "You must be glad." She did not look up. "I'm sorry," he said. "I've rather enjoyed it all. And " she began, then paused. "I was sorry about yesterday," he said gravely, interpreting her thoughts, "but it was unavoidable. I ran down to see him this morning," he added, "but he had gone. He realizes that I am not Alfred Warren." Again there was a period of silence. There seemed nothing more to be said. She refused to be forgiven, and it now remained for him only to make his adieux, return to the vicarage, and prepare for the journey west. Suddenly he had an inspiration. "Will you take me to say good bye to Nero?" he asked. She rose immediately, then paused half way towards the window. "Only 4 lumps at the outside," she warned. "But this is a parting," he pleaded. "We may never meet again, and, because you won't be friends, you surely won't come between Nero and me." Without a word she passed out through the French windows, and across the lawn in the direction of the stables. From behind a clump of holly Eric watched the scene, speculating as to his chances of bowling practice. At the sight of Marjorie and his sugar man approaching, Nero became almost frantic with excitement. He blew through his lips in an ecstasy of anticipation. Marjorie called it purring, stretching his shapely neck over the half door of his loose box to its utmost limit. The sight of Smith thrusting his hand into his pocket caused Nero to add to the purr a soft whinny of joy. His sugar man had not only come to see him, but had brought with him those white cubes of joy without which life would lose much of its attractiveness. "Nero, you must be good," admonished Marjorie as she fondled his silky neck, whilst Smith extended a hand on which lay 4 of the largest lumps of sugar he had been able to steal from Janet's store at the vicarage. As he munched the crisp morsels, there was an expression in Nero's eyes which told of perfect content. Was he not in the presence of his beloved mistress, with whom he had such glorious gallops, stopping at nothing and caring for nobody? Was there not with her his sugar man, in whose pockets the white cubes grew as he had never known them to grow elsewhere? As the last morsel disappeared, Nero stretched out a peremptory head towards Smith. He was ready for more. "Don't you think it's a little unfair to Nero?" Smith was saying. "Unfair to Nero?" she repeated, not following the line of his thoughts. "Not to allow yourself to be forgiven," he smiled. "I mustn't give you any more, old fellow," he said, as Nero manifested impatience at the neglect of so obvious a hint. I didn't mean to say I wouldn't be forgiven," she said, conscious that once more she was colouring beneath his steady gaze. "What I meant was, I cannot forgive myself." "In the meantime Nero must go without sugar," he suggested. "I don't see Nero!" she broke off. "You wicked person!" Impatient at the lack of response to his clearly expressed wishes for more sugar, Nero had caught Smith's coat sleeve between his teeth and was shaking it as a dog shakes a rat. At the smart pat on the side of his head which Marjorie administered, he dropped the coat sleeve and turned upon her a pair of reproachful eyes. He hated being corrected at any time, but before his Sugar Man. "You shouldn't be naughty," she said. Then drawing his head towards her and rubbing her face against it, she added, "You must behave, Nero dear." For a second he allowed himself to be caressed. Suddenly he started from the gently restraining hand of his mistress. There, piled up in the Sugar Man's hand, was more white bliss than he ever remembered to have seen before. He craned forward, but the tempting pile was just out of reach. The Sugar Man was looking at his mistress. Why didn't he come nearer? The top of the door hurt, still he must get that snowy mount. Suddenly the mount came within his reach. The interrogation in the Sugar Man's eyes, which Nero had not observed, had been answered with a little nod, and he was crunching more sugar at once than he had ever crunched before in his life. "Can't you see Nero asking you what has become of me?" Smith enquired, as he watched the obvious enjoyment with which his largesse was being eaten. "Nero cannot always have his own way," she retorted, with a lightness she was not feeling. "Think of Willis unhappy, and Mrs. Higgs having hysterics, and Mrs. Death indulging in visions." "Whatever do you mean?" she cried, with puckered brows. He explained the allusion. "But my not being able to forgive myself will not produce all those catastrophes," she protested. "It will," he replied solemnly. "Then there's Eric's bowling practice." "Oh!" she cried, startled. Her face dyed suddenly crimson. She turned aside, and her eyes dropped. "Don't you think we might be friends?" he said gently, bending towards her. She did not reply, still keeping her head turned from him. "I stayed on because He paused. "Wanted to get to know you better," he added. Nero watched the pair with speculative eye. Miraculously, a second mount of white sweetness had taken the place of the first. Here indeed was a king among men. "You will try and forgive yourself?" he persisted. "I You mustn't give Nero another piece," she cried, "so please come away." "On condition that it is to the pine wood," he said, as he produced two more lumps of sugar for Nero. "I must talk to you, and I think the pines will help." She turned, and he followed, leaving Nero in the enjoyment of the last of Janet's sugar. In silence they recrossed the lawn, Eric dodging to cover just in time. A few minutes later, with a little sigh of content, Marjorie sank down upon the carpet of pine needles, Smith dropping beside her. He made no effort to break the silence, but continued to gaze steadily at the profile she turned towards him, as she allowed the pine needles to sift through her fingers. His silence puzzled her. Why had she come to the pine wood? What was he thinking? Was he going that day, or would he remain on until the morrow? "I want to tell you something," he said at length. She looked up quickly, a startled look in her eyes. "I've just heard that Alfred Warren was killed at Neuve Chapelle." For several minutes there was silence. Instinctively her thoughts had flown to South Africa, where a widow would weep for an only son. "He made good," said Smith presently. "I'm glad," she said simply. "Poor grey lady," she added. "Grey Lady?" he queried. "I always call Lady Warren Grey Lady," she said, with a sad little smile. "Tell me about her." When nearly half an hour later she concluded with the words, "She's the most beautiful old lady I have ever known," Smith felt something more than a passing compassion for the mother who had suffered so much because of an erring son. "And now I want to tell you something," she said, after another long silence, taking up another handful of needles and allowing them to cascade back to their mother carpet. She paused, then as he made no response, she continued. I tried to dislike you." She paused again, the pine needle slipping silently through her fingers. "I think," she continued, as she took another handful, "I think I always knew in my really that you were not Mr. Warren, but I forced myself to dislike you." "Yes," he said gently, as she hesitated, giving him a swift look from under her lashes. "Mr. Warren always frightened me, and you I wasn't frightened of you." The words came with a rush, as if they had forced themselves out against her will. "Marjorie," he said gently, taking the hand from which the last pine needle had fallen. "Please!" There was genuine distress in her voice, and in the eyes she turned on him there were tears, pendulous upon the lower lids. "Are you going to punish us all?" "Oh, please don't!" she murmured, as one tear lost its balance and tumbled down her cheek. "Don't you think you might try and learn to like me a little for myself? I try frightfully hard to deserve it, and I don't mind how long I wait." His voice shook slightly. There was a pause. His instinct was to take her in his arms, she looked so pathetic, so distressed. "You don't understand," she murmured. "You would always remember." "I should remember only one thing, Marjorie," he said. "I want you and " She had not withdrawn her hand. Gently he drew her towards him, and a moment later all danger to Eric's cricket practice was over. "You'll never think of it," she whispered, a few minutes later. "Never," he vowed. I just wouldn't let myself," she continued, "and once I hit Nero because he oh!" A soft muzzle had been thrust between their heads. "Nero!" she cried, sitting up straight, her hands flying to her disordered hair. "You wicked person! Who let you out?" But Nero was too busy nuzzling Smith's pockets to explain that he represented Eric's masterstroke of diplomacy. Suddenly there came a whoop from behind them. "I say, isn't it Spiff?" cried an ecstatic voice, and a red head appeared from behind a tree. "It'll be murder if I catch you," laughed Smith, making a movement in the direction of the red blob, where it had disappeared, and once more the pine wood resumed its sombre colouring of greys and greens and browns. The End. End of The Return of Alfred by Herbert George Jenkins. Read by Anna Simon, 2011.